The bathroom mirror in the Carter apartment reflected a Tuesday morning like any other, which was precisely what made it dangerous. Maya Rose Carter, 14 years old and 5 feet 2 inches of quiet determination, stood brushing her curly dark brown hair with the kind of careful attention that came from knowing how easily beautiful things could be destroyed. The curls fell in thick waves to the middle of her back, each strand representing months of careful growth, cheap leave-in conditioner rationed like medicine, and a stubborn refusal to cut it despite her mother's suggestions that shorter might be easier. Easier had never been Maya's goal. Surviving was. She applied the conditioner with practiced efficiency, her fingers working through tangles that had formed overnight, despite the silk pillowcase her mother had saved 3 months to buy. The bathroom smelled like drugstore coconut and the faint mildew that came from living in a rental, where the landlord's definition of maintenance stopped at keeping the lights on and the water running. Maya had learned not to complain about things that couldn't be fixed with determination alone. Some battles were worth fighting. Others were just noise that distracted from the war. The colorful scarf went on last, tied at the base of her skull like a hidden superhero cape, the kind of detail that made her feel less ordinary, even when ordinary was all anyone ever saw. She looked at herself in the spotted mirror and whispered the same thing she whispered every morning, a ritual that had started 2 months ago when the videos began and the laughter followed her through hallways like smoke. Just one more day. In the kitchen, Rose Carter moved through the morning routine with the exhausted grace of a woman who had worked closing shift at Save Mart until 11 the previous night and would be back there at 3 this afternoon, squeezing in 2 manicure appointments between shifts because rent was due, and the scholarship that kept Maya at Grayson Academy covered tuition but nothing else. At 36, Rose carried the kind of beauty that exhaustion enhanced rather than diminished. Dark hair pulled into a practical ponytail, hands that remembered how to hold wrenches and handlebars, even though they spent their days now scanning groceries and filing nails. She noticed Maya's quiet in the way mothers do, the particular silence that meant her daughter was carrying weight she refused to share. Rose had been watching that silence grow for 2 months, watching Maya withdraw into herself like a creature learning to survive by becoming invisible, and every instinct she possessed screamed that something was wrong. But when she asked, Maya deflected. When she pushed, Maya shut down. And Rose, who had once known how to handle threats with more direct methods, found herself helpless against an enemy she couldn't see. "Are you okay, honey?" The question came out for the third time that morning, each iteration sounding more desperate than the last. "I'm fine, Mom." Maya's response was automatic. Practice the kind of lie that teenagers tell when the truth feels too heavy to burden parents who are already carrying too much. "You've been so quiet lately." Maya hesitated at the door, her hand on the knob, something flickering in her expression that Rose couldn't quite read. For a moment, it looked like her daughter might actually tell her something real might crack open that careful armor and show her mother the wounds beneath. But then Maya's face smoothed into neutral determination, and the moment passed. "I'm just tired. School's been intense." Rose felt a chill crawl down her spine despite the apartment's stuffy warmth, a premonition that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with instinct, honed over years of reading danger in the space between words. Her hand moved almost unconsciously to her purse on the counter, fingers brushing the worn leather wallet where she kept the essentials. Driver's license. Debit card with $127 until Friday. Maya's school photo from last year. And behind that photo, folded so many times the creases had worn thin, a piece of paper with a phone number written in permanent marker 10 years ago by a man who had promised her that if anyone ever hurt her daughter, she should call. She almost pulled it out. Almost dialed. Almost asked Victor Hawk Daniels if he still remembered the promise he'd made at Daniels' funeral, if a decade of silence had erased obligations forged in grief and leather and brotherhood. But what would she say? "My daughter seems sad. She's withdrawing." Every teenager goes through phases, and dragging the iron wolves into normal adolescent struggles felt like using a sledgehammer to hang a picture frame. Rose had left that world 10 years ago specifically to give Maya a normal life, and she wasn't going to pull her daughter into the gravity of motorcycles and road names and promises sealed with blood just because her maternal anxiety was running high. She put the wallet back without pulling out the number, let her hand fall away from the purse, told herself she was being paranoid. It was the worst decision she would make in a decade of mostly good ones. "Maya Lara, whatever you need, you tell me, immediately." "Understood," Maya nodded, gave her mother a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and left for school. The door closed with a soft click that sounded to Rose's ears like the ceiling of a tomb. Grayson Academy sat on 12 manicured acres in Riverside, Illinois, 30 miles southwest of Chicago, and operated on the kind of budget that came from tuition checks written by parents who viewed education as another luxury good, like German cars, in vacation homes in Aspen. The building itself was red brick and white columns architecture that screamed old money and tradition, the kind of place where legacies mattered more than merit and connections opened doors that talent alone could never unlock. Maya entered through the side entrance at 7:52 a.m., 8 minutes before first bell, a timing calculated to minimize hallway exposure, while avoiding the stigma of being either too early or too late. She had learned the rhythms of this place the way prey learns the hunting patterns of predators, had mapped every blind spot, and learned which stairwells were safe and which ones became theaters for humiliation. The school's social hierarchy was unwritten but absolute, enforced with the kind of casual cruelty that came naturally to teenagers who had never faced consequences for anything. At the top sat the football team and their satellite cheerleaders, demigods in Letterman jackets, who moved through hallways like they owned them, because in every way that mattered, they did. Below them came the influencers, students with follower counts in the hundreds of thousands, who had monetized high school into brand partnerships and sponsorship deals, who filmed every interaction like life was content, and other people were just extras in their personal reality show. At the bottom were the extras, the scholarship kids and the anxious ones, and anyone whose parents couldn't write checks large enough to make problems disappear. Maya lived in that bottom tier, known enough to be targeted, but invisible enough that no one would come to her defense. Brandon Cole owned the top. At 15, he stood 6 feet 1 inch of athletic grace, blonde hair that fell just perfectly imperfect across his forehead, a smile trained for cameras that had been recording his life since he got his first smartphone at age 10. His TikTok account had 150,000 followers. His Instagram, another 70,000. To adults, he was charming and well-mannered, the kind of boy who said, "Sir and ma'am," and made adults feel good about themselves for thinking the younger generation wasn't entirely lost. He wore his privilege like cologne, expensive and noticeable, and teachers loved him because his father was Richard Cole, one of Chicago's most powerful attorneys, and the Cole family donated $500,000 annual to Grayson's scholarship fund. To the students who actually paid attention in the hallways, Brandon was something else entirely. The kind of person who understood that power came from knowing exactly where to hit, to leave marks that wouldn't show up on police reports. He was calculated in his cruelty, strategic in his humiliations, and he had made Maya his project for the past 2 months. It had started small, the way these things always do. Week 1, he had yanked her backpack as she walked past, filmed the books scattering across the floor, posted it with a laughing emoji and the caption, "When you trip over your own feet." 2,000 views, 73 comments, most of them laughing. Week 3, he had filmed her stuttering through an answer in English class, applied a ridiculous filter that made her face distorted, and her voice sound like a cartoon character, shared it in 3 different group chats. 5,000 views. The nickname Curl Drama appeared in her mentions. Week 5, he had poured water on her chair right before she sat down in the cafeteria, captured the moment her uniform went dark with wetness, the panic in her eyes as she realized she'd be walking around looking like she'd pissed herself for the rest of the day. 8,000 views. Comments ranged from "OMG dead" to "Someone get this girl a diaper." Week 7, he had stolen her lunch and made her pick items off the floor one by one while his friends filmed threatening to step on each piece if she didn't move fast enough. He hadn't posted that one. It was a test Maya understood later. Practice for something bigger. This morning as Maya walked to her locker, she didn't know that Brandon had already been at school for 30 minutes. Didn't know about the group chat called Hallway Kings, where 347 students had voted overnight on today's challenge, where options included food fight and fire alarm prank and shave curl. Drama's head in class didn't know that option 3 had won with 89% of the vote, or that Brandon had posted a photo of the professional grade hair clippers he'd bought yesterday at a beauty supply store, still with the price tag attached. She didn't know that Mike Torres, Brandon's teammate, and the only person who had tried to object, had been dismissed with Brandon's casual confidence that his father's legal expertise and the family's annual donations made him untouchable, that school policy bent around him like light around a black hole. Maya just knew with the animal instinct of someone who had been hunted for weeks that something felt different this morning. The way Brandon's friends watched her in the hallway, the phones that turned to follow her movement, the smirks that felt less spontaneous and more coordinated, like everyone was in on a joke she hadn't heard yet. She made it to second period without incident, told herself she was being paranoid, tried to focus on the water cycle presentation she was giving in science class third period, a topic she'd chosen specifically because facts and diagrams felt safer than anything requiring personal interpretation. At 10:17 a.m., Maya walked into room 8B carrying a poster board in the last fragments of a normal Tuesday morning. The classroom smelled like the industrial cleaner the janitorial staff used, and the particular staleness of air that had been recycled too many times through an HVAC system that needed replacing. Mrs. Lynn, 53 years old and counting down the days until retirement, let her escape a career that had stopped feeling like a calling around the same time administrators started prioritizing test scores over actually teaching, was setting up the projector with the defeated energy of someone going through motions they'd repeated 10,000 times. Maya went to the front of the room, poster board in hand, trying to ignore the whispers that rippled through the class like wind through grass. 22 students, 17 with phones either openly on their desks or hidden in their laps, all of them watching her with an attention that felt predatory rather than academic. Brandon sat in the back row, hand inside his backpack, casual smile on his face like butter wouldn't melt in his mouth. Mike Torres sat beside him, looking distinctly uncomfortable. Kept glancing at Brandon and then away, like someone watching a car accident in slow motion who knew it was coming but couldn't figure out how to stop it. Maya, you may begin when you're ready. Mrs. Lynn's voice carried the particular disinterest of a teacher who had given up trying to make students care about science. Maya took a breath, positioned her poster, started talking about precipitation and evaporation and condensation concepts that followed reliable rules that behaved predictably, that made sense in ways that social hierarchies never did. Her voice was quiet but steady. She'd practiced this a dozen times. The water cycle was safe, controllable, no surprises. She was 3 minutes into her presentation explaining how temperature affects precipitation patterns when Brandon stood up from his seat. He made a show of walking to the trash can at the side of the room, moving with deliberate casualness that should have alerted Mrs. Lynn, except that Mrs. Lynn was looking at her phone half hidden behind her grade book, scrolling through something infinitely more interesting than 14-year-olds presenting about meteorology. Maya noticed Brandon moving but didn't process it as a threat. He was just getting up to throw something away. That's what students did. It was normal. She took a step backward and adjusting her poster against the whiteboard, still talking about cloud formation and atmospheric pressure, not noticing that her movement had placed her directly in the center aisle between rows of desks, not noticing the way phones around the room had risen slightly, cameras pointing in her direction, not noticing Mike Torres' face going white as Brandon pulled something from his backpack. The hair clippers were professional, grade cordless, the kind barbers use normally loud, but Brandon had tested them yesterday and discovered that if you held them at just the right angle against fabric, the buzzing sound got muffled enough to be almost unnoticeable in a classroom with rattling air conditioning and the ambient noise of teenagers who couldn't sit silently even when pretending to pay attention. It happened faster than thought, slower than nightmare. Brandon crossed the distance in 3 quick strides, moving with the confidence of someone who had never been told no about anything that mattered. His left hand grabbed Maya's hair at the crown of her head, fingers wrapping around curls, and yanking her head backwards so hard her neck cracked, and his right hand pressed the clippers to the base of her skull at the nape of her neck. The buzzing sound cut through the air like a scream. Maya froze, not from decision, but from shock, her body locking up the way systems shut down when they encounter inputs they weren't built to process. First came the sound mechanical and wrong, then the sensation of cold metal against her scalp, then the feeling of strands separating from her head in chunks, heavy clumps of hair falling onto her neck, her shoulders, the floor around her feet. Look at the camera, curl drama. Brandon's voice was loud, excited, feeding off the energy in the room the way addicts fed off their drug of choice. Wave goodbye to your rat's nest. The classroom erupted. Some students laughed that high-pitched, nervous laughter that comes from watching something terrible and not knowing how else to respond. Others gasped. Most did nothing except film phones held high, documenting violence like it was entertainment, like Maya's humiliation was content to be shared and liked and commented on. Mrs. Lynn, finally looking up from her phone, finally registering that something was wrong, took 5 full seconds to process the scene. 5 seconds where Brandon continued running the clippers across Maya's scalp, creating irregular paths of bare skin, while Maya stood frozen and other students filmed, and the universe continued forward with the terrible momentum of things that cannot be stopped once they've started. Stop, get away from her. Mrs. Lynn's voice came too late and too weak, and by the time she crossed the room and grabbed the clippers from Brandon's hand, 43 seconds had passed and large chunks of Maya's hair were scattered across the white tile floor. Maya brought her hand to her head slowly, like someone checking for injuries after an accident. Her fingers found gaps where there should have been hair, found short, irregular patches where Brandon had pressed too hard and the clippers had scraped skin, found warm wetness that was blood from where metal teeth had dug too deep, mixing with tears. She didn't know she was crying. The world narrowed to a pinpoint. Sound became distant and warped. She heard her own breathing too fast, too shallow. Heard phones clicking as screenshots were taken. Heard someone say, "Oh my God," in a voice that sounded more excited than horrified. Heard Brandon laughing. Heard the laughter spread like infection through students who, moments ago, had been normal teenagers, but who were now something uglier. Something that fed on suffering the way sharks fed on blood and water. "Maya, come with me to the nurse's office." Mrs. Lynn appeared at her shoulder, hand extended, voice shaking with something that might have been guilt for responding too slowly, or fear of lawsuits, or just the general panic of a teacher realizing that something very bad had just happened on her watch and she didn't know how to fix it. Maya looked at that extended hand and felt something crack inside her, some fundamental trust in adult protection that had already been worn thin by 2 months of harassment that teachers had witnessed and ignored. She didn't take the hand, didn't want to be touched by adults who took 43 seconds to intervene, who scrolled through their phones while students were terrorized, who preached about kindness and respect while allowing cruelty to flourish in spaces they were paid to supervise. She stepped over her own hair, heard the crunch beneath her sneakers, each step crushing physical evidence of violence that was already being transformed into entertainment. Behind her, someone said, "This is going to get so many views." And Maya heard in those words the complete commodification of her suffering, the reduction of her trauma to engagement metrics. In the hallway, she heard the first notification sounds, text messages arriving in bursts. The video was already spreading, sent through AirDrop and Snapchat and Instagram, DM edited in real time with music and scissor emojis and laughing, crying faces, her worst moment becoming someone else's content, her humiliation packaged and distributed and consumed by people who would forget about it by tomorrow while she would carry it forever. The coordinator's office door opened as Maya passed. Ms. Rodriguez calling her name, wanting her to come inside, wanting to handle this internally, wanting to protect the school's reputation by containing the damage before it spread beyond campus. Maya kept walking, through the side exit, out into cold November air that felt like a slap. Past the parking lot where other students were arriving late, where life continued in its normal rhythms because only Maya's world had just ended, everyone else's day proceeding according to schedule. She didn't go home. Her feet carried her on instinct, following some unconscious map her body remembered, even though her conscious mind had been trained to forget. East through residential streets, where houses got progressively smaller and less maintained. Past the strip mall where her mother worked, where Rose was probably stocking shelves or covering someone's shift, exhausted and trying to make rent. Past the community college and the recycling plant, and into the industrial district, where warehouses shared space with auto body shops and businesses that operated on cash and didn't ask questions. Maya stopped walking when she couldn't walk anymore, when her legs gave out, and she found herself standing before a metal gate with spray paint art she didn't recognize, but that Rose's heart would have known from a mile away, an iron wolf coiled around a burning wheel, fierce and protective and absolutely unbreakable. Above the gate, a faded sign, "Iron Wolves MC." Maya had been forbidden from coming here her entire life, had been taught that motorcycles meant danger, that leather vests meant criminals, that the world her mother had left behind was a world that destroyed people and offered nothing in return. But standing there with her hair in bloody patches and her uniform covered in evidence of violation, and her phone buzzing with notifications about videos being shared in group chats where her name was turning into a punchline. Maya didn't care about warnings. She cared about finding somewhere that wasn't home, somewhere her mother wouldn't see her like this, somewhere that maybe possibly someone would look at her and see something other than a victim, to be pitied or content to be shared. She pushed the gate open, stepped inside, crossed a threshold that 10 years of careful protection had tried to keep her from ever reaching. The interior of the warehouse smelled like motor oil and leather and strong coffee smells that spoke to work being done with hands rather than keyboards, to communities built around shared labor rather than shared hashtags. Maya entered slowly, vision blurry, breathing ragged every step, taking effort she wasn't sure she had. 6 men working on motorcycles stopped in mid-motion. Tools hit concrete. Conversation died. Silence fell with the weight of moments when something unexpected walks into a space that operates on routine and familiarity. At the back of the warehouse, sitting in an old office chair that had been patched with duct tape and stubborn refusal to buy new furniture, a man who looked like he'd been carved from oak in bad decisions set down his coffee cup and stood slowly. Victor Hawk Daniels was 49 years old, 240 pounds of muscle and scar tissue, gray beard that couldn't quite hide the strong jawline beneath the scar bisecting his left eyebrow from a bar fight 20 years ago that he'd started and finished. His arms looked like tree trunks covered in tattoos that told stories of places he'd been and brothers he'd lost, and his eyes carried the particular weight of someone who had seen both the best and worst that humanity had to offer. He looked at the thin girl standing in his doorway, irregularly bald, trembling like a deer that had run from wolves only to stumble into the den of something larger, and he saw not a stranger but a ghost. Saw Rose 15 years ago running from an abusive stepfather and asking for protection with eyes that held the same desperate courage. Saw Daniel Ace Carter, his brother in every way that mattered, the man who had helped him build this chapter from nothing, whose funeral Hawk had given the eulogy at while a 4-year-old girl cried in her mother's arms. Saw that same 4-year-old girl, now 14, standing before him with evidence of violence in every line of her body. "You're Ace's daughter." It wasn't a question. Hawk didn't deal in questions when he already knew answers. Maya blinked, confused tears cutting clean tracks through whatever dust and grief covered her face. "My dad was Daniel. I didn't know where else to go." The admission broke something in her, the last fragment of control shattering like glass under pressure, and she collapsed right there on cold concrete that had supported motorcycles and memories and brotherhood for 15 years. Her sobs were ugly and loud and completely uncontained, the kind of crying that comes from suffering that's been held back too long, that erupts with force proportional to the pressure used to contain it. Hawk crossed the warehouse in 4 heavy strides, stopped 3 feet from her, didn't reach out to touch her because he understood that trauma made people flinch from physical contact even when that contact was meant to comfort. Instead, he did something no adult at Grayson Academy had thought to do. He took off his leather vest, the one with Iron Wolves MC across the back and President patched above his heart, the one that represented 15 years of building a brotherhood from scattered broken men into something that resembled family, and he placed it over Maya's shoulders like a blanket. "Who did this to you?" His voice was deep, gravelly from years of shouting over motorcycle engines and smoking cigarettes he'd quit 5 years ago. But it held something different from any adult Maya had encountered in the educational system. No pity, no hand-wringing about policy and procedure, just controlled rage, the kind that doesn't explode outward but burns inward, superheating until it melts metal and reshapes reality. Maya tried to answer. Her throat closed. The tears came harder now, sobs that shook her whole body, and she curled into herself on that concrete floor, like if she made herself small enough, she might disappear entirely. Hawk crouched beside her and waited. Didn't push, didn't demand, just provided presence, solid and unmovable, an anchor in a world that had just proven itself fundamentally unsafe. On the other side of the warehouse, Marcus Ghost Rivera, 38 years old, vice president, mechanic and hacker, in the hours when his hands weren't covered in grease, pulled out his phone, pulled up TikTok, typed Grayson Academy into the search bar without knowing exactly what he was looking for, just following instinct that said if a kid showed up this destroyed, there was digital evidence somewhere. The video had been posted 14 minutes ago. already had 12,000 views. Hawk. Ghost's voice cut through the warehouse. It's already trending. He turned his phone. The video played. Maya being grabbed. The clippers cutting through her hair. Collective laughter in the background. Her face frozen in that terrible moment between understanding and response. The caption, Curl drama goes baldy, LOL. Grayson challenge #viral goals at King Brandon. Hawk closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Took a breath deep enough that his chest expanded and his shoulders rose. When he opened his eyes, there was no room for doubt about what would happen next. Ghost call everyone. Emergency meeting. Now. Hawk, we can't just storm a school and break the kid's face. The voice came from Leo Chains Torres, 29 years old tattoo artist, youngest member of the chapter. Someone who remembered the old days when problems got solved with fists and consequences came later. We'll end up in jail and that won't help anything. Hawk stood all 6 feet 3 inches and 240 of him, rising like a mountain coming into being. Who said anything about hitting his smile was dangerous, the kind that promised suffering measured in years rather than moments. We're going to do this the right way, the way that hurts more. Within 15 minutes, the warehouse filled with 23 bikers, men and women ranging from 25 to 60 years old, all wearing matching black vests with the Iron Wolf symbol, all carrying the particular energy of people who had been called from work and errands and normal Tuesday activities because the word family meant something more serious than comments on Instagram photos. Among them were 3 volunteer lawyers who worked with the MC on domestic violence cases, a former cop who understood exactly how far they could push without crossing lines that would destroy their case, and enough collective fury to burn down the city if Hawk gave the word. But Hawk had learned over 15 years and too many mistakes that fury without strategy was just noise. Maya sat in a folding chair wrapped in Hawk's vest that was 3 sizes too big, holding a bottle of water someone had pressed into her hands, wearing a black cap to cover the patches where her scalp showed through. She didn't quite understand what was happening, couldn't process the tornado of activity swirling around her, but for the first time in 2 months she felt something other than fear. She felt seen. Hawk clapped his hands once the sound sharp enough to cut through conversation and side discussions and the general chaos of 23 people trying to organize around rage. Everyone. This is Maya, Ace's daughter, Raven's daughter. 28 minutes ago, she was physically assaulted inside a private school, filmed, humiliated, and the video is going viral right now. While we speak. Where's her mother? The question came from Nina Viper Santos, 42 years old, former Chicago PD, until she realized the department cared more about protecting power than serving justice scar across her throat from a domestic violence call that had gone sideways, eyes that missed nothing. Her mother doesn't know yet. Hawk kept his voice steady. Maya came straight here. Ghost held up his phone, showing evidence he'd compiled in the 15 minutes since Maya arrived. The guy who did this is Brandon Cole, 15 years old, local influencer, over 220,000 followers combined. The video's at 18,000 views already. Comments are 90% laughing. The other 10% are saying someone should report it, but nobody's actually doing anything. And the school Viper's question cut to the heart of institutional failure. Total silence so far. No statement, no suspension, nothing. Hawk turned to Maya, crouched down so he was at her eye level, gave her the dignity of making eye contact. Maya, I'm going to ask you a question, and you answer only if you want to. Do you want us to handle this? She looked up at him, confusion evident. Handle it how? The right way. Legal, without beating anyone up, but in a way that nobody will ever forget. We document everything. We file police reports. We bring lawyers. We make so much noise that they can't ignore it or bury it or pretend it didn't happen. We protect you the way you should have been protected from the start. Maya thought about her mother, about the videos spreading through every phone at Grayson, about walking back into that school tomorrow and pretending everything was fine. Thought about Brandon's laugh and misses, Lynn's delayed response, and the 43 seconds when everyone just watched and filmed. For the first time that day, Maya didn't lower her head. I want you to. Hawk nodded. Then here's what we're going to do. The plan came together with practiced efficiency. Ghost would download and back up every piece of digital evidence, logging timestamps and view counts in comments that would establish pattern and premeditation. Viper would call Rose, explain where Maya was, bring her into the fold, because keeping mothers in the dark only made things worse. Sarah Chen, 45 civil rights attorney, who'd been riding with the wolves for 6 years, would file formal police reports with Detective Anderson, one of the few cops they trusted to actually investigate rather than cover up. And then once all the legal groundwork was laid, once they had documentation and evidence and witnesses lined up, they would do something that had never been done in Riverside's history. They would ride. Rose Carter's phone rang at 11:43 a.m. while she was stocking the cereal aisle at Save Mart, the thousandth box of cornflakes, finding its place on a shelf that never stayed full, surrounded by the fluorescent lighting and easy listening music that had become the soundtrack to her life's diminished ambitions. The number was unfamiliar. She almost didn't answer. Some instinct made her pick up. Rose Carter. The voice was female professionals, careful. Yes, who is this? This is Nina Santos. You knew me as Viper. From the Wolves. Rose's world tilted sideways, grocery store in cornflakes and normal Tuesday dissolving into memories she'd spent 10 years trying to bury. Viper. She remembered a woman with sharp eyes and a scar across her throat, remembered Daniel introducing them at a barbecue shortly before the accident, remembered thinking that Viper looked like someone who'd seen too much and refused to look away. What happened? Is someone hurt? Rose's mind immediately went to the worst possibilities, to the ways that motorcycle clubs attracted trouble like magnets attracted metal. Your daughter's here. She's safe, but she needs you. Safe and needs me are contradictions. Rose heard her own voice rising, heard the panic that came from a decade of protecting Maya from the very world that was now calling to say she was there. What happened? Someone hurt her. At school. She came to us. The phone almost slipped from Rose's hand. She caught it, pressed it so hard against her ear it hurt. I'm coming. Tell me where. Same place. You remember, Rose remembered. Could have driven there blind and backwards, muscle memory, stronger than conscious thought. She told her manager there was a family emergency, didn't wait for approval before grabbing her keys and running, drove too fast through Riverside streets that she'd navigated carefully for 10 years, always avoiding that industrial district, always taking the long way around the place where Daniel had found Brotherhood and she had found family, until that family killed him with its love of speed and risk and living like consequences were theoretical. She pulled up to the warehouse at 11:58 a.m., parked crooked, ran through the gate she'd sworn never to enter again. Saw Maya sitting in a folding chair wearing a vest 3 sizes too big and a cap covering her head, and Rose's brain took 3 full seconds to process what she was seeing, to understand that her daughter's hair was gone, that something terrible had happened, that her worst fear had manifested in a form she'd never imagined. Oh my God. Maya, Maya. Rose's voice broke on her daughter's name, and she crossed the concrete in 5 running steps, collapsed to her knees in front of the chair, pulled Maya into a hug so tight it felt like she was trying to merge 2 people into one. Maya held on like drowning, sobbing into her mother's shoulder, and Rose felt every protective instinct she'd ever had activate, simultaneously felt rage and grief and guilt compete for dominance in her chest. Why didn't you tell me? Why come here alone? Rose pulled back, held her daughter's face in both hands, looked at the irregular patches where hair used to be, at the blood stains on her uniform at trauma, written in every line of her body. Because I knew you would do anything to protect me. Maya's voice was small, broken, painfully honest. And I didn't want you to come back to this world. Rose looked around at the warehouse, at the men and women in leather vests, at faces she remembered from another life at Hawk, standing back, giving them space, but clearly running this operation. She saw the evidence Ghost had compiled, the phones recording the lawyers taking notes, the careful documentation of violence that the school had already tried to bury. Baby, Rose's voice steadied with decision. This world never left me. I just pretended it did. Hawk approached slowly, boots heavy on concrete. Raven. He used her road name deliberately, acknowledging the person she'd been before she became Rose Carter's supermarket clerk and manicure artist. Rose stood turned, looked at the man who'd helped her escape 10 years ago, who'd scraped together cash and contacts and given her the gift of anonymity. Hawk, it's been a while, too long. He extended his hand. Rose ignored it and pulled him into a hug, brief but fierce, the kind that acknowledged debt and friendship and the complicated history of people who had been family before life scattered them. Thank you for taking care of her. She's family. Always has been. Rose wiped her eyes, straightened her shoulders, looked at the assembled bikers who were watching this reunion with the kind of careful attention that said they were ready to follow her lead to take orders from a woman who'd left the life but clearly hadn't forgotten how it worked. What are you going to do? Hawk's answer was simple. What we always do. Protect those who can't protect themselves, but the right way. Are you with me, Rose Carter, who had spent 10 years trying to build a normal life, who had scraped and saved and worked 2 jobs to keep her daughter in a private school where she'd believed Maya would be safe, who had sacrificed everything to escape the world of leather vests and motorcycles and brothers who solved problems with loyalty rather than law, looked at her daughter sitting in borrowed vest and knew that normal had failed. The system had failed, the school had failed, every adult who was supposed to protect children had failed. What she needed now wasn't normal. What Maya needed was family. I'm with you. At 2:47 p.m., 63 motorcycles lined up single file on Industrial Boulevard, exactly 200 yards from Grayson Academy's main entrance. They didn't rev their engines, didn't make noise, didn't do anything except sit there in perfect formation. Riders dismounting in synchronized silence, walking slowly toward the school's parking lot until they formed a perimeter that surrounded the property without ever stepping foot on it. Every single rider wore a black Iron Wolves vest. Every single rider had a portable body camera on their chest recording. Every single rider moved with the disciplined silence of people who understood that one wrong move would undermine everything they were trying to accomplish. Hawk led the walk. Rose beside him, Maya a step behind, wearing her borrowed vest and her cap and an expression that was equal parts terror and determination. Behind them came 23 members of the Iron Wolves MC, 3 lawyers with briefcases full of documentation. Nina Viper Santos with her former cop knowledge of exactly how far they could push, and Ghost with his laptop ready to live stream everything to social media platforms where evidence couldn't be deleted or buried. Inside the school, panic spread like wildfire. Principal Patricia Wheeler looked out her office window, saw the sea of leather and motorcycles and went pale in a way that suggested actual physiological response to threat rather than mere anxiety. Her hands shook, reaching for the phone. There's a gang outside. Her voice climbed toward hysteria. Hundreds of bikers. We need police here now. 4 squad cars arrived within 7 minutes, lights flashing, but sirens off because even the responding officers understood that sound would escalate rather than calm. Police Chief Marcus Cooper stepped out of the lead vehicle personally, one hand resting near his service weapon, eyes scanning the crowd with mixture of suspicion and something that might have been grudging professional respect for how organized and controlled this demonstration was. Hawk walked forward slowly, hands clearly visible at his sides, moving with careful deliberation that announced he was a threat to no one unless someone made him one. He stopped 10 feet from Chief Cooper and waited until the chief acknowledged him with a slight nod. Chief Cooper, good afternoon. We're here to report a felony assault that occurred this morning in room 8B. The victim is a minor. We have video evidence. We'll be waiting peacefully for the school's response and appropriate legal action. Cooper studied him, taking in the gray beard and the scars and the patches that announced leadership of an organization the police had been watching for 15 years without ever finding enough evidence to call them criminal. You planning on causing trouble? No, sir. Hawk's response was immediate, respectful in ways that subtly challenged the chief's assumptions about who deserved courtesy. But we're planning on shining light on trouble that's already here. Trouble that's been allowed to flourish because people in authority look the other way. Something flickered in Cooper's eyes, some recognition that this wasn't standard MC intimidation, but something different, something harder to handle because it operated within legal boundaries. He glanced at his officers at the school, calculating odds and optics. We'll be watching. Any hint of violence, any intimidation of students or staff, you're all going to jail. Understood. We're here to protect children, Chief, same as you. Cooper returned to his vehicle but didn't leave parking, where he had clear sight lines to both school and bikers settling in for what promised to be a long afternoon. The other squad cars took similar positions, creating perimeter that was either protective or threatening, depending on perspective. As afternoon pickup began, parents arriving to collect their children that slowed their cars, confused by the scene unfolding. Some turned around immediately, deciding their kids would walk or take the bus rather than navigate whatever this was. Others parked and approached on foot phones, out filming, asking questions that no one could answer yet because the story was still being written. Inside the school, students gathered at windows. Whispers spread through hallways. Text messages flew. Within 15 minutes, every student at Grayson Academy knew that Maya Carter's people had arrived, that the girl they'd laughed at and filmed and dismissed as acceptable target had somehow called down an army. Brandon Cole stood at his locker scrolling through notifications on his phone, editing the morning's video to repost with new filters and music when someone grabbed his arm. "Dude, look outside." Brandon walked to the nearest window and froze. Below in the parking lot, 63 bikers stood in silent formation, not moving, not chanting, not making demands, just present with the kind of pressure that silence creates better than noise ever could. And at the front, standing beside a massive bearded man in a president's vest, stood Maya, wearing that same vest, and her mother beside her, and an expression on her face that Brandon had never seen before. Not fear, not submission, something that looked almost like power. "What the hell did I do?" Brandon's voice came out small, the confident influencer persona cracking to reveal the 15-year-old underneath who was just starting to understand that actions had consequences, and some consequences couldn't be managed with lawyers and donations. "You messed with a motorcycle club's daughter." Mike Torres appeared beside him, the linebacker who tried to warn him, whose face now held something between vindication and genuine concern. "I told you, man. I told you this morning." Below in the parking lot, Hawk picked up a megaphone. His voice boomed across the space, clear and controlled. "Attention, students of Grayson Academy. What happened here today was not a prank. It was a crime. Assault, battery, distribution of child exploitation imagery. And we didn't come here to take justice into our own hands. We came to ensure justice is done the right way. Through police reports, through lawyers, through every legal channel that exists. But we came in numbers because institutions ignore individuals. They can't ignore us." Silence held for 3 beats. Whoever saw what happened this morning, whoever laughed, whoever shared that video, think hard about the kind of person you want to be. Because the internet doesn't forget, and neither do we. Then Rose took the megaphone. Her voice shook at first, but strengthened with each word. "My daughter was humiliated this morning, but she will not be destroyed, because she's not alone. And if there's one thing I learned in this life, it's that real family isn't who shares blood. It's who shows up when you need them. Thank you to everyone here who proved that today." Applause began not from everyone, but from students in windows, from parents at the gate, from teachers standing in doorways who had seen too much cruelty go unpunished and were relieved to finally see someone push back. The main entrance opened. Principal Wheeler emerged with a tall man in expensive suit. Richard Cole, Brandon's father, one of Chicago's most powerful attorneys, whose face carried the particular fury of someone unaccustomed to being challenged. "Officer Cooper, I want these people arrested for trespassing and intimidation." Richard's voice carried authority earned from 20 years of courtrooms and victory. Hawk's response was calm. "We're not on school property. We're on public sidewalk 200 yards away. First Amendment protects peaceful assembly. We have attorneys on site if you'd like to discuss constitutional law." Richard's jaw clenched. "You think you can intimidate my son? I'll sue every single one of you for harassment, emotional distress. I'll take your motorcycles, your clubhouse, everything you own." Rose stepped forward. "Your son assaulted my daughter, filmed it, posted it online. That's a crime regardless of how much money you have. Alleged assault." Richard's smile was sharp as broken glass. "Kids prank. Boys will be boys. My son says she provoked him." Brandon appeared behind his father, trying to look innocent, trying to disappear into his father's shadow. When Maya made eye contact with him across the parking lot, he made a gesture with his finger, circling his temple. Crazy. The universal symbol for dismissing someone's reality. Something snapped in Maya. She stepped forward. Hawk tried to stop her, but she was already moving, was already done being silent. Her voice rang out across the parking lot, small but clear, carrying farther than anyone expected from someone so thoroughly destroyed just hours earlier. "You held me down. You cut my hair while I bled. You laughed while people filmed. And you're calling it a prank." The words came fast, fueled by 2 months of swallowed rage and 43 seconds of frozen horror, and every moment since when she'd been made to feel like her suffering didn't matter. You made me a joke. You made me want to die. And you think that's funny? The parking lot went silent. Brandon's smirk faltered. Students watching from windows stopped filming. Even Richard Cole paused, thrown by the raw emotion that couldn't be dismissed or spun or reframed as teenage drama. Chief Cooper stepped forward. Mr. Cole, I think we need to have a conversation. Based on what I'm seeing here, there's credible allegations of assault on a minor. We need to investigate. Richard's face darkened. Don't you dare. Do you know how much my family contributes to this town? Cooper's expression hardened. I know exactly how much you contribute. I also know the law applies to everyone. Then let's go to court. Hawk's voice cut through the tension. We have evidence, witnesses, video documentation. We'll see you there, counselor. Richard Cole stared at this collection of bikers and lawyers, and a mother who had called down an army to protect her daughter. And for the first time in his professional career, he felt something close to doubt. These weren't people who could be intimidated or bought off. These were people who had nothing to lose and everything to fight for. We're not done. Richard grabbed Brandon's arm, pulled him toward their Mercedes. This isn't over. But as they drove away, Ghost whispered to Hawk what they were all thinking. That went too easy. Cole's not done. He'll come back harder. Hawk nodded. Neither are we. What none of them knew yet was that Richard Cole was already dialing a number he kept for emergencies, calling a man named Derek Snake Morrison, who ran a different kind of motorcycle club, the kind that didn't care about legal boundaries or peaceful demonstrations, the kind that solved problems with methods the Iron Wolves had left behind years ago. What none of them knew was that this Tuesday afternoon confrontation was just the opening move in a war that would escalate beyond anything they anticipated, that would draw in corrupt cops and complicit school boards and criminal gangs that would push them to limits they didn't know they had. But standing there in the parking lot of Grayson Academy, with 63 Iron Wolves surrounding her with her mother beside her and Hawk's vest on her shoulders, and the knowledge that someone had actually shown up when she needed them, Maya felt something she hadn't felt in 2 months. Hope. The first battle was over. The war was just beginning. Richard Cole did not lose. Not in courtrooms, not in boardrooms, not in the carefully cultivated world where money and connections bent reality to accommodate men like him. He had spent 23 years building a reputation as Chicago's most ruthless civil attorney, had won cases that should have been unwinnable, had made problems disappear for clients who paid him enough to ensure their secrets stayed buried. His success was not built on legal brilliance alone, but on understanding that the law was simply one tool among many, and that sometimes the most effective tools existed outside courtrooms and depositions. The Tuesday evening, after 63 motorcycles had surrounded his son's school, Richard sat in his home office in Riverside's most expensive neighborhood, leather chair and mahogany desk and windows overlooking landscape gardens that cost more to maintain than most families earned in a year. He had sent Brandon to his room with instructions to delete every social media account and say nothing to anyone, had poured 3 fingers of scotch that he didn't drink, and had made phone calls to people whose names didn't appear in any directory. The first call was to Marcus Finn, a private investigator who had helped Richard bury inconvenient truths before, whose specialty was finding leverage on people who thought they had nothing to hide. Richard's instructions were simple and absolute. I want everything on Rose Carter. Criminal history going back to birth, financial records, employment history, traffic violations, everyone she's ever associated with. Dig until you find something we can use. Marcus's voice came back professional and neutral. The motorcycle club, especially the club. Richard leaned back in his chair, swirled scotch he still hadn't tasted. Find DUIs, assaults, drug charges, gang affiliations. I don't care if it's 20 years old or happened when they were 17. Find the dirt and bring it to me. What if there isn't any dirt? There's always dirt. Richard ended the call and immediately made another, this one to a number he'd hoped never to use again, to a man whose help came with costs that couldn't be measured in billable hours. The phone rang 4 times before Derek Snake Morrison answered, voice rough from cigarettes and bad decisions. Yeah, Derek, it's Richard Cole. We met at the Riverside fundraiser last year. I need a favor. Snake remembered. Remembered the attorney who donated $50,000 to the Police Benevolent Fund and made sure everyone knew it, who'd made small talk about supporting law enforcement, while his eyes calculated how useful those connections might be. What kind of favor? There's a motorcycle club causing problems. Iron Wolves MC. I need them discouraged, made to understand that backing off is in their best interest. Silence on the line, the kind that came before numbers were discussed. How discouraged we talking to scared enough to drop this crusade they have started? Richard finally took the sip of scotch, felt it burn going down. Scared enough that they choose self-preservation over some teenage girl's hurt feelings. For that kind of discouragement, we're talking 50,000. Richard didn't hesitate. Done. Half now, half when it's finished. They'll back off. Snake's confidence was absolute. Or they'll disappear. Your choice. Just make it look unrelated to my son. The last thing I need is blowback. We're professionals. Snake ended the call, leaving Richard alone with his scotch and the kind of moral compromise that men in power told themselves was necessary, that protecting family justified any method, that the ends always excuse the means. What Richard didn't know was that the Iron Wolves had been documenting everything since Maya walked into their warehouse. Didn't know that Ghost had already hacked into school security systems and had footage of every conversation Brandon had about planning the assault. Didn't know that Sarah Chen, the civil rights attorney, had been building cases against wealthy defendants for 6 years and knew exactly how men like Richard operated. Didn't know that his phone calls were being monitored by Viper, whose years in Chicago PD had taught her which cops were dirty and which ones could be trusted to look the other way when former cops bent rules to protect kids nobody else cared about. War had been declared. Both sides just didn't know yet that they were fighting different wars with different rules that would collide in ways that destroyed everything they thought they knew about winning. The next morning, Rose woke to her phone ringing at 6:47 a.m., a time that meant either emergency or someone who didn't care about courtesy. The caller ID showed Riverside Department of Children and Family Services. Rose's stomach dropped even before she answered. Carter, the voice was professional female, carrying the particular tone of authority that social workers develop from years of delivering news that ruin lives. This is Dr. Angela Foster from DCFS. We received a complaint regarding your daughter Maya. We need to schedule a home visit to evaluate her living environment. Rose sat up in bed, heart pounding. What kind of complaint? I'm not at liberty to discuss details over the phone. Dr. Foster's response was practice scripted. But the complaint alleges that Maya is being exposed to gang activity and potentially dangerous individuals. We take all reports seriously and are required to investigate. Gang activity. Rose heard her own voice rising. My daughter was assaulted at school. We sought help from people who could protect her. That's not gang activity, that's community support. Nevertheless, we need to conduct an evaluation. I can be at your residence this afternoon at 2 p.m., or we can schedule another time. But the investigation will proceed regardless. Rose wanted to refuse, wanted to tell Dr. Foster that this was retaliation for speaking up, that powerful people were using the system to punish victims instead of perpetrators. But she'd spent enough years navigating bureaucracy to know that resistance only made things worse, that social workers had power to remove children based on perceived risk even when actual evidence was thin. 2 p.m. is fine. Rose kept her voice steady despite the panic crawling up her throat. We'll be here. After the call ended, Rose sat in her bed staring at walls she'd painted herself when they moved in at the small apartment that was clean and safe and everything she'd been able to afford on her salary, and felt the particular helplessness of people who discover that doing the right thing can be punished more severely than doing nothing at all. She called Hawk at 7:15 a.m. He answered on the second ring voice alert, despite the early hour, probably already awake and working on motorcycles or strategy, or the 1,000 details that running a Brotherhood required. CPS called. They're investigating me for exposing Maya to gang activity. Rose didn't bother with greetings or small talk. Someone filed a complaint, probably Cole. Hawk's response was immediate. We get Sarah there when they visit. Make sure everything's documented. They come after you for protecting your daughter, we make noise about it. Hawk, what if they take her? Rose's voice cracked on the question she'd been afraid to articulate. What if I lose her because I asked for help? You won't. Hawk's certainty was absolute in ways that Rose couldn't share. We've got lawyers. We've got documentation. We've got a community ready to testify that Maya is loved and protected and safe with you. But Rose knew what Dr. Foster would see. Would see the photo on the mantle of Rose and Daniel in their Iron Wolves vests. young and in love, and part of a world that social workers were trained to view as inherently dangerous. Would see the modest apartment and the two jobs that barely covered rent and a single mother whose support system consisted of motorcycle club members who looked exactly like what concerned citizens imagined when they heard the word gang. Would see reasons to remove Maya that had nothing to do with actual safety and everything to do with bias and assumption and the way systems protected themselves by punishing anyone who challenged their authority. The media war began on Thursday morning when Elena Martinez, 28-year-old reporter for the Riverside Tribune, published an article that went viral within hours. The headline appeared on the newspaper's website at 8:00 a.m., accompanied by photos of the Iron Wolves surrounding Grayson Academy that made 63 peacefully assembled protesters look like an invading army. Motorcycle gang harasses local school bikers, intimidates students and staff in protest over discipline. Incident. The article was masterful in its manipulation, presenting just enough facts to seem credible while omitting context that would have changed everything. It mentioned Maya's assault only as discipline incident, and classroom altercation made no reference to the video evidence or the 43 seconds Mrs. Lynn had taken to respond, focused instead on the frightening spectacle of dozens of leather-vested bikers surrounding a school where children studied. Elena had interviewed Principal Wheeler, who described feeling terrorized by the display, who claimed the school had been handling the situation internally before being forced to deal with outside interference. She'd interviewed parents who'd been scared to pick up their children, who worried about gang violence spilling into their community, who questioned why the school allowed scholarship students whose families had such dangerous connections. She'd interviewed Richard Cole, who appeared in a photo wearing expensive suit and concerned father expression, who talked about his son being targeted by vigilantes, about how a teenage mistake was being blown out of proportion by people looking for a lawsuit payday, about the need to protect children from both bullying and mob justice. The article mentioned Maya only as the student in question and referred to the assault as alleged inappropriate contact between students, language that transformed violence into something ambiguous and mutual, that suggested blame might be shared rather than clearly assigned. Brandon Cole was described as a popular student and social media influencer who had made an error in judgment, but who was now being subjected to threats and harassment that far exceeded any misdeed he might have committed. The article included screenshots of his old content showing him doing charity work and community service, images carefully curated by Richard's PR team to present a boy who made one mistake rather than a calculated bully who had tormented Maya for months. By noon, the article had been shared 14,000 times across social media. Comment sections filled with outrage directed not at Brandon, but at the Iron Wolves at Rose for exposing her daughter to dangerous people at Maya Bar for supposedly provoking the incident and then weaponizing it with outside help. The narrative had shifted. Victim and perpetrator had been reversed. Maya went from sympathetic to suspicious, from someone who'd suffered violence to someone whose family was using that violence for personal gain. Rose read the article on her phone during her morning break at Save Mart, standing in the employee break room that smelled like burnt coffee and disappointment, and felt her world tilt sideways. She'd been so focused on protecting Maya through legal channels that she hadn't anticipated the counter-narrative, the way that money and connections could reshape reality itself. Her manager, Dennis Patterson, 56 years old and counting days until retirement, called her into his office at 1:30 p.m. He looked uncomfortable in the way people did when they were about to do something they knew was wrong but felt they had no choice about. "Rose, I need to talk to you about something." Dennis gestured to the chair across from his desk. "We've been getting complaints from customers about you being associated with a motorcycle gang." Rose felt cold settling in her chest. "I'm not in a gang. I asked friends for help protecting my daughter after she was assaulted at school." "I believe you," Dennis sounded genuine. "But corporate doesn't care about context. They care about brand image and customer complaints and avoiding controversy. I'm sorry, but they're requiring me to let you go." The words hit like physical blows. "You're firing me for protecting my daughter. I'm firing you because your personal situation is affecting business." Dennis couldn't meet her eyes. "I wish I didn't have to, but my hands are tied." Rose walked out of Save Mart at 1:47 p.m., 14 years of retail experience and decent performance reviews, meaning nothing against the reality that power protected power and everyone else got sacrificed. She sat in her car in the parking lot and called her afternoon manicure appointments to cancel, called the landlord to ask about payment plans for next month's rent, called her mother in Michigan to ask if she could borrow money she knew her mother didn't have, called Hawk and said the words that felt like confession of failure. I lost my job. They fired me for asking you for help. Hawk's response was immediate and absolute. We'll handle rent until you find something else. You don't lose your home for doing the right thing. But Rose knew how money worked in communities built on limited resources, knew that the Iron Wolves had charity funds and operating expenses and couldn't subsidize her, indefinitely knew that accepting help meant accepting dependence that could transform into obligation that could corrupt the very thing she'd sought to protect. She went home and found Maya sitting on the couch doing homework, like this was a normal day, like her mother hadn't just lost employment and they weren't facing CPS investigation, and the entire town wasn't reading articles that painted them as the villains. Rose sat beside her daughter and tried to figure out how to explain that sometimes justice costs more than people could afford to pay. Mom, are we going to be okay? Maya's question was small, frightened, carrying awareness that 14-year-olds shouldn't have to carry. Rose pulled her daughter close and lied with the conviction that mothers develop from years of promising children things they couldn't guarantee. We're going to be fine. We have people who care about us. We'll get through this. But lying in bed that night, unable to sleep, Rose replayed Daniel's accident in her mind for the 1,000th time. The police showing up at her door at 3 a.m. The closed casket funeral because the damage had been too severe. 4-year-old Maya asking where Daddy went and why he wasn't coming home. The Iron Wolves surrounding her with promises of eternal support and brotherhood, while Rose thought the only thing that brotherhood had given her was a dead husband and a daughter who would grow up without a father. She'd run from that world because it had killed Daniel with its love of speed and risk and the kind of living that treated death as acceptable collateral. Now she'd run back to it to protect Maya, and she couldn't shake the feeling that history was repeating itself in new forms, that the very people she'd trusted to save her daughter might end up consuming them both. At Grayson Academy, Principal Wheeler called Maya's mother on Friday morning with news delivered in the tone administrators used when they were inflicting punishment while pretending to offer protection. Mrs. Carter, we've made the decision to suspend Maya pending completion of our internal investigation into the incident. You're suspending the victim. Rose's disbelief was absolute. My daughter was assaulted and filmed, and you're punishing her. We're providing a cooling-off period for everyone's safety. Wheeler's response was practiced. Given the tensions and the involvement of outside individuals, we feel it's best if Maya stays home until we can ensure a secure learning environment. Translation: the school was protecting Brandon and punishing Maya for the crime of having people who cared enough to fight for her. Rose wanted to scream, wanted to drive to the school and demand they explain how removing the victim while the perpetrator remained in classes made any kind of sense. But she'd learned enough about institutional power to know that screaming only gave them justification to paint her as unstable. How long is this suspension? That will depend on the investigation. We'll be in touch. The call ended, leaving Rose staring at her phone and understanding with crystal clarity that Grayson Academy had never intended to protect Maya, that their initial silence after the assault hadn't been oversight, but policy, that institutions always protected themselves and their donors before they protected the vulnerable. Maya took the news with the kind of numbed acceptance that came from having too many bad things happen in too short a time. So I get assaulted and I lose school too. Just temporarily, Rose tried to sound hopeful, until we can get this resolved. But Maya was 14 and smart enough to understand that temporary often became permanent, that suspensions turned into expulsions, that being labeled as the problem student followed you forever regardless of what actually happened. That afternoon, Dr. Angela Foster arrived at the Carter apartment at exactly 2:00 p.m., clipboard in hand, expression neutral in the way social workers learned to be accompanied by Sarah Chen, who had insisted on being present to ensure the evaluation remained professional rather than turning into a fishing expedition for evidence to justify predetermined conclusions. Dr. Foster walked through the apartment, slowly taking notes on things Rose couldn't see, making judgments about cleanliness and organization, and whether this modest space was adequate for raising a teenager. She looked at the photographs on the mantel, paused on the one showing young Rose and Daniel in their Iron Wolves vests, baby Maya between them. This is from your time in the motorcycle club. Dr. Foster's question was carefully neutral. That's my late husband. Rose kept her voice steady. He died 10 years ago. I left the club when I became a single mother because I wanted to give my daughter a stable life. But you've recently reconnected with them. I asked for help when my daughter was assaulted and the school did nothing. Rose felt Sarah's hand on her shoulder, a silent reminder to stay calm. They responded legally and appropriately. They've been nothing but supportive. Dr. Foster made notes. Rose imagined what those notes said, how words like motorcycle club and gang activity would be used interchangeably, how seeking help from bikers would be framed as exposing child to dangerous individuals, regardless of context. Maya, can we talk privately? Dr. Foster turned to where Maya sat on the couch, nervous and small, wearing a beanie to cover the irregular patches where her hair had been cut. Sarah Chen intervened smoothly. As Mrs. Carter's legal counsel, I'd prefer to be present for any interviews with a minor. I'm just trying to ensure Maya feels comfortable speaking freely. Dr. Foster's smile didn't reach her eyes. Then let's all talk together. Sarah gestured to the living room. That way everyone's comfortable. The interview was careful and calculated. Dr. Foster asking questions designed to sound concerned, but structured to elicit responses that could be used as evidence of risk. She asked about the Iron Wolves, about whether Maya felt safe around them, about whether she'd witnessed any illegal activity or substance use, whether anyone had made her uncomfortable or said anything inappropriate. Maya answered honestly, said the bikers had been kind and protective, that Hawk had given her his vest when she was scared, that they'd helped her mother file police reports and hire lawyers and do everything the right way. But Rose watched Dr. Foster's face and knew that honesty was being filtered through assumptions that kind and protective were being heard as grooming and manipulation, that every positive thing Maya said about the Iron Wolves was being reframed as evidence of indoctrination. After 90 minutes, Dr. Foster packed up her clipboard and delivered her preliminary assessment. I'll need to complete my report and consult with my supervisor. We'll be in touch about next steps. Her tone suggested those next steps would not be positive. When she left, Rose collapsed on the couch beside Maya and Sarah, all three of them exhausted from the careful performance of seeming normal and stable and safe in an evaluation designed to find reasons they weren't. That went better than expected. Sarah tried to sound optimistic. She didn't find anything obviously wrong, but you should prepare for the possibility that they might require monitoring. Regular home visits, therapy for Maya, proof that you're providing appropriate supervision. And if I can't afford therapy, Rose's question was bitter. I just lost my job. Sarah's expression softened. The Iron Wolves have a fund for exactly this kind of situation. You're not alone in this. But Rose felt alone despite being surrounded by people offering help. Felt the walls closing in from every direction, felt like she was drowning in consequences that came from choosing to protect her daughter instead of staying silent. At the Iron Wolves warehouse, tensions were rising among members who felt that legal strategy was moving too slowly while the enemy was attacking on multiple fronts. The younger members gathered in small groups, voices carrying frustration that Hawk had to address before it turned into mutiny. Leo Chains Torres, 29 and still carrying the impulsiveness of youth despite years in the Brotherhood, voiced what others were thinking. We're getting destroyed while we play nice. Cole's hiring investigators, getting the mother fired, weaponizing CPS. When do we hit back? Hawk stood in the center of the warehouse, surrounded by men and women he'd led for 15 years, feeling the pressure of leadership that meant making decisions others disagreed with. We hit back by winning, legally. The moment we cross that line into violence or intimidation, we lose everything. Maya loses. Rose loses. We all lose. So we just take it, another voice from the back. Let them attack us while we document it, yes. Hawk's voice was hard, because documentation wins trials. Violence just puts us in jail. But the frustration didn't dissipate, just went underground, manifesting in muttered conversations and dark looks that suggested patience was eroding faster than Hawk could restore it. He knew his people knew that many had joined the Iron Wolves specifically because it represented a departure from criminal activity, but also knew that old instincts died hard, that the seduction of direct action was strong when indirect methods seemed ineffective. Ghost pulled him aside after the meeting, voice low enough that others couldn't hear. We need a win soon, something visible, Because if Cole hits us again and we don't hit back, you're going to lose control of the younger members. I know. Hawk rubbed his face, exhaustion evident. But what kind of wind? Cole's covered his tracks. The school's protecting him. Even the police chief seems reluctant to actually investigate. The answer came at 2:47 a.m. on Saturday morning, when flames erupted from the warehouse's south wall, igniting insulation and old wood and 15 years of accumulated memories, with accelerant-fueled fury that overwhelmed fire suppression systems designed for accidental blazes rather than deliberate arson. Hawk lived above the warehouse in a small apartment he'd converted years ago, woke to smoke alarms, screaming, and heat that made the floor too hot to walk on barefoot. He grabbed jeans and boots, and his phone called 911 while running down the exterior stairs, saw flames pouring through windows where ghost computers had been, where legal documents and case files and evidence they'd compiled had been stored. The fire department arrived within 8 minutes, but by then the damage was catastrophic. The south wall collapsed inward. Motorcycles that had been parked too close were destroyed by heat and falling debris. Glass exploded from windows, sending shards across the parking lot like shrapnel. And worst of all, the room where Ghost had set up his tech operation was completely consumed, computers melting into slag hard drives, warping beyond recovery, backups that should have been fireproof, succumbing to temperatures that exceeded their rating. Ghost arrived 15 minutes after the first alarm, stood in the parking lot watching his work burn, and said the words everyone was thinking. They destroyed our evidence. Hawk stared at flames that were eating his chapters home and felt rage building that he'd been suppressing for days, the kind that started cold and precise and then heated into something that could consume everything it touched. This was professional. They knew where to hit. The fire marshal, who arrived at 4:30 a.m., confirmed what they already suspected. Multiple ignition points, gasoline accelerant, message spray painted on the east wall that had been partially destroyed, back off or burn. The Iron Kings. Viper said it with certainty, born from years of recognizing gang signatures. Cole hired them. This has Snake's fingerprints all over it. Can we prove it? Sarah Chen appeared, had gotten the call, and driven straight from her home in Chicago, looked at the burning warehouse with the practiced assessment of someone calculating legal options. Fire marshal will investigate. We'll have evidence of arson. But connecting it to Cole, Ghost shook his head. That's harder without digital evidence we just lost. Hawk felt the weight of leadership pressing down, felt his members watching to see how he'd respond, knew that this was the moment where he either maintained control through restraint or lost everything to the seductive simplicity of retaliation. Leo Chains, Torres stepped forward, voice carrying the fury of the entire chapter. Now can we hit back? They burned our home, Hawk. This is war, yes. Hawk's voice was quiet, dangerous, absolute. This is war, but we're still fighting it our way. We document, we investigate, we build a case so airtight that Cole and everyone he hired goes to prison for years, while they burn our lives down around us. Chain shook his head. You're asking us to be punching bags. I'm asking you to be smart. Hawk met his eyes. Violence feels good for about 5 minutes. Then you're in jail and the people you wanted to protect are alone. Justice takes longer, but it lasts. The standoff held for 3 long seconds before Chains backed down, not convinced but loyal enough to follow orders he disagreed with. But the tension remained visible in set jaws and clenched fists, and the way younger members clustered together, having conversations that stopped when Hawk got too close. As dawn broke over the burned warehouse, as firefighters finished their work and investigators began processing the scene, Ghost pulled Hawk aside with something between confession and triumph. I lost the computers, but everything was backed up to cloud storage that nobody knows about. Every file, every piece of evidence, everything. Thank God. Hawk felt relief wash over him. So we can rebuild the case. Better. Ghost's smile was sharp. I can trace the payment that hired the Iron Kings. There's always a digital trail. Always. And I'm going to follow it right back to Richard Cole. The discovery that changed everything came on Sunday afternoon when Ghost, working from a borrowed laptop in a diner 3 miles from the burned warehouse, found the connection no one had expected. He'd been tracing financial records, following money from Cole's various accounts, looking for payments to the Iron Kings or to Derek Snake Morrison personally. What he found instead was a series of transfers from Cole's law firm to an account registered to Officer Tom Bradley, a 35-year-old Riverside cop who'd been one of the responding officers to the warehouse fire, who'd taken statements and promised thorough investigation and seemed genuinely concerned about the arson. The transfers went back 6 months, $5,000 per month every month deposited 2 days after Cole's firm billed its biggest client. The amounts were small enough to avoid automatic reporting, but large enough to buy loyalty to ensure that cases involving Cole's interests got handled with appropriate discretion, that investigations stalled at convenient moments, that evidence somehow failed to materialize when needed. Ghost dug deeper, found text messages between Bradley and an unlisted number that traced to a burner phone, found communications about the Iron Wolves, about their movements, about case strategy that Bradley shouldn't have known about unless someone was feeding him information from inside the police department. Found finally a text sent at 1:47 a.m. Saturday morning, 3 hours before the fire target vulnerable. South wall, no cameras. Officer Tom Bradley hadn't just failed to prevent the arson, he'd provided the intelligence that made it possible. Ghost called Hawk immediately. "We have a dirty cop, and I can prove it." The implications cascaded outward like dominoes falling. If Bradley was on Cole's payroll, who else was? How deep did the corruption go? Could they trust Detective Anderson, who'd been assigned to investigate Maya's assault? Could they trust Chief Cooper, who'd responded to the school demonstration? Could they trust any part of the system they'd been trying to work within? Sarah Chen examined the evidence Ghost had compiled, checked and rechecked the digital trail, and finally delivered her assessment. This is enough for internal affairs. Maybe enough for federal prosecution if we can show pattern of corruption. But who do we report it to? Viper's question cut to the heart of their dilemma. If Bradley's dirty, how many others are? We go to his supervisor and it gets buried. We go to IA and maybe the captains on Cole's payroll too. We go public. The suggestion came from an unexpected source, Elena Martinez, the reporter who'd written the hit piece, who'd shown up at the warehouse that morning, looking simultaneously ashamed and determined. We publish the evidence. Make it too big to bury. Why would you help us? Hawk studied her with suspicion born from being burned once. You wrote that article calling us a gang. Elena met his gaze steadily. I wrote what I was told to write. Richard Cole's firm is one of my editor's biggest advertisers. I didn't ask enough questions. Didn't verify enough facts. I let myself be used to spread a narrative that wasn't true. And I'm trying to make it right. How do we know you won't just do it again? Rose had arrived at the warehouse despite Hawk's suggestion she stay away, couldn't sit home while the people helping her daughter were under attack. Because I saw what they did to you. Elena turned to Rose, expression raw. I have a daughter, she's 8, and if someone did to her what Brandon did to Maya, I'd want people to show up. I'd want an army. Instead, I wrote an article that made you the villain. I'm sorry, let me fix it. The silence that followed was heavy with calculation, with the weight of choosing whether to trust someone who'd already betrayed them once, with understanding that sometimes allies came from unexpected places, and that purity of motivation mattered less than willingness to act. Hawk made the decision. You want to fix it, then write the truth. All of it. The assault, the cover-up, the corrupt cop, Cole hiring the Iron Kings, everything. Elena nodded. I'll need to go around my editor. Publish somewhere he can't kill the story. But yes, I'll write the truth. The article went live on Tuesday morning, not in the Riverside Tribune, but on an investigative journalism website called The Prairie Watchdog, published under Elena Martinez's byline, with the kind of detail that came from someone who'd done actual reporting instead of transcribing press releases. How a powerful attorney bought a school board. Richard Cole's network of corruption, cops, schools, and cover-ups. The piece documented everything Brandon's assault on Maya with full context about the 2 months of escalating harassment that preceded it. Mrs. Lynn's 43-second delay in responding, Principal Wheeler's attempt to handle it internally, the school board members who'd received legal services from Cole's firm, Officer Bradley's payments, and his role in providing intelligence for the warehouse arson, the systematic harassment of Rose Carter, including her termination from employment in the weaponized CPS investigation. Elena had interviewed Mike Torres, who provided on-record testimony about Brandon planning the assault and explicitly stating his father would protect him. She'd interviewed 3 other Grayson students who'd been bullied by Brandon over the years and whose complaints had been dismissed. She'd interviewed former teachers who'd been fired for reporting behavior that administrators didn't want documented. She'd included documentation of the financial ties between Cole and the school board, between Cole and local law enforcement, between Cole and the media itself. She'd exposed the entire ecosystem of power that protected abusers while punishing victims, and she'd done it with the kind of meticulous sourcing that made it impossible to dismiss as conspiracy theory or biased reporting. The article went viral within hours. By evening, it had been picked up by the Chicago Tribune and the Associated Press. By the next morning, it was national news mentioned on CNN and MSNBC, shared across social media platforms by influencers and advocacy groups, and people who'd never heard of Riverside, Illinois, but recognized the pattern of institutional corruption, protecting the powerful while sacrificing the vulnerable. The pressure became too great to ignore. By Wednesday, the State Board of Education announced an independent investigation of Grayson Academy. The Illinois Attorney General opened an inquiry into Richard Cole's business practices. The FBI field office in Chicago received enough complaints to justify looking into possible federal civil rights violations. And on Thursday morning, Maya Rose Carter woke to find that the narrative had shifted back, that she was no longer the problem, but the victim, that people were finally seeing the truth about what had been done to her and who had protected those who did it. But the victory felt hollow because that same Thursday morning brought news that made everything else seem secondary, that reminded everyone involved that the real cost of this battle wasn't reputation or legal fees, but human suffering that couldn't be undone by articles or investigations. Maya had been reading the comments. For 3 days, she'd been suspended from school, sitting at home, while her mother went to the warehouse to help coordinate legal strategy, scrolling through her phone, reading what the internet thought about her situation. Some comments were supportive people expressing outrage at what Brandon had done, at how the school had failed her, at the systematic corruption that had tried to bury her assault. But others were not. Others called her attention seeker and said she was making it all up for sympathy, called her mother gang whore and said Maya deserved what happened because of who she associated with, created memes of her bald head with cruel captions, posted death threats and rape threats and suggestions that she should kill herself if she couldn't handle a harmless prank. The harassment was relentless and anonymous, coming from burner accounts and VPNs impossible to stop or trace or defend against. Maya reported accounts and they reappeared under new names, blocked users, and they created new profiles. Every time she checked her phone, there were new messages, new comments, new reminders that the internet had decided she was an acceptable target, that her suffering was entertainment for people who would never face consequences for their cruelty. She stopped eating properly, stopped sleeping more than a few hours, stopped answering when her mother asked if she was okay, because okay felt like a language she'd forgotten how to speak. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw the irregular patches where her hair was growing back, and thought about how much easier everything would be if she just didn't exist anymore, if she could stop being the problem that was causing so much trouble for everyone who loved her. On Thursday night, after reading a particularly vicious thread suggesting that Maya had provoked Brandon and was using her mother's gang connections to extort money from an innocent family, something inside her simply broke. She opened the medicine cabinet in the bathroom, looked at her mother's prescription sleeping pills, the ones Rose took when insomnia got too bad, poured them into her palm and counted. 15 pills, probably enough. She texted Jenna Park, the only friend from Grayson, who'd stayed in contact, who'd filmed the assault from a side angle, and provided that evidence to the lawyers. "I'm sorry. I can't do this anymore. You were a good friend." Then she sat on her bed holding the pills and thinking about how much it would hurt her mother, but also about how Rose's life would be easier without a daughter who'd become a liability, who'd caused her to lose her job and face CPS investigation and get pulled back into a world she'd spent 10 years escaping. Jenna read the text message and understood immediately what it meant, had read enough about suicide warning signs to recognize goodbye when she saw it. She called 911, called Rose's cell phone 7 times before getting an answer, screamed into the phone that Maya had sent a suicide message and Rose needed to get home now. Rose broke speed limits getting back to the apartment, ran up 3 flights of stairs, found the bathroom door locked and Maya not responding to her pounding and screaming. She kicked the door open with strength born from pure terror, found Maya on the bathroom floor holding pills she hadn't swallowed yet, sobbing so hard she could barely breathe. Rose collapsed beside her daughter and pulled her into a hug so tight it hurt. sobbing herself, taking the pills, and throwing them across the bathroom, holding Maya like if she just held tight enough, she could physically prevent her daughter from slipping away. "Don't leave me. Please, baby, don't leave me." Rose's voice broke on every word. "You're all I have. You're everything. Please don't go. I'm making everything worse." Maya's words came between sobs. "You lost your job because of me. The warehouse burned. Everyone hates us. It would be easier if I just wasn't here." "No," Rose pulled back, held Maya's face in both hands, forced her daughter to look at her. "You didn't make anything worse. Bad people did bad things and were fighting back. That's not your fault. None of this is your fault." But the internet, Rose couldn't even finish before Maya interrupted. "Fuck the internet." Rose rarely swore made the word count. "Fuck every anonymous coward who says terrible things because they're too weak to show their face. They don't matter. You matter. You are brave and strong and valuable, and I will fight the entire world to keep you safe." The ambulance arrived 17 minutes later. Paramedics checked Maya's vitals, confirmed she hadn't taken any pills, recommended psychiatric evaluation at the hospital. Rose rode with her daughter in the back of the ambulance, holding her hand, whispering reassurances that felt inadequate against the weight of Maya's suffering, but were all she had to offer. At Riverside Memorial Hospital, Maya was placed on a 72-hour psychiatric hold, transferred to the adolescent mental health unit, where walls were painted soothing colors and all the fixtures were designed to prevent self-harm, and teenagers in various states of crisis moved through routines meant to keep them alive until they could remember why they wanted to be. Dr. Judith Walsh, 50 years old with 3 decades of experience treating trauma survivors, interviewed Maya in a small room that was supposed to feel comfortable but just felt institutional. She asked questions about the assault, about the harassment, about the thoughts that led Maya to consider ending her life, and listened with the kind of practiced patience that made Maya feel slightly less alone in her suffering. "What you experienced was severe trauma." Dr. Walsh's voice was gentle but direct. "Assault, public humiliation, ongoing harassment, loss of safety at school. Watching your mother suffer consequences for protecting you. That's more than most adults could handle, let alone a 14-year-old. So I'm crazy for not being able to handle it." Maya heard the defensive edge in her own voice. "You're human, and you're hurt. And hurt people sometimes think about stopping the pain permanently because they can't imagine it ever getting better." Dr. Walsh leaned forward slightly. "But Maya, it does get better. Not quickly, not easily, but it does. And you deserve to be here to see it." The words didn't fix anything. Couldn't undo the assault or stop the harassment or make the internet forget or give Maya back the sense of safety she'd lost when Brandon grabbed her hair. But they were something to hold on to in the darkness, some small assertion that she mattered enough for a stranger to spend time convincing her to stay alive. In the waiting room, Rose sat with Hawk, who'd arrived 30 minutes after getting her call, both of them exhausted and terrified and trying to figure out how to protect a child from enemies that existed everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. "I almost lost her." Rose's voice was hollow. "Not to Cole or Brandon or any of the people attacking us, to the weight of it all, to her own thoughts. But you didn't." Hawk put his hand on her shoulder. "She's here, she's getting help. And we're going to make sure every person who pushed her to this point faces consequences." How Rose looked at him with eyes that had seen too much. How do we fight anonymous internet trolls and systemic corruption in a culture that treats teenage suffering as entertainment? Hawk didn't have an easy answer because there wasn't one. Some battles couldn't be won with legal strategy or muscle or money. Some battles required something harder to sustain. Persistent, tedious, unglamorous work of changing systems, one person at a time, of holding institutions accountable, when they'd rather bury problems, of choosing to show up every day even when progress felt invisible. "We do it together" was all he could offer. "We keep fighting, we keep showing up. And we make sure Maya knows she's not alone." It would have to be enough. The news that Maya had attempted suicide didn't stay private because nothing stayed private anymore in a world where crisis was content and suffering was shareable. By Friday morning, Elena Martinez had published a follow-up article detailing the harassment Maya had faced online, the death threats and rape threats and cruel memes, the way that even being publicly vindicated hadn't stopped anonymous accounts from continuing to torture a 14-year-old girl until she saw death as preferable to living. The article named the suicide attempt directly with Rose's permission given because she was tired of protecting the sensibilities of people who'd shown Maya none, because making the cost visible seemed like the only way to make anyone care about the consequences of their cruelty. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The hashtag had Justice for Maya trended nationally. Celebrities with millions of followers shared the story. TikTok launched an investigation into the harassment accounts. Instagram implemented new policies about bullying content. And thousands of people who'd never met Maya sent messages of support. It shared their own stories of survival, proved that she wasn't alone in her suffering, even when it felt like she was drowning. But the most significant response came from an unexpected source. Father Marcus O'Brien, 63 years old, priest at St. Catherine's Catholic Church in Riverside, called Hawk on Friday afternoon and asked if the Iron Wolves would be willing to meet at his church on Sunday to discuss coordinating a community response. Father Marcus was respected across Riverside, had served the parish for 37 years, had buried and baptized and married half the town, commanded the kind of moral authority that even secular people acknowledged. He was also someone who understood that institutions often failed the vulnerable, that sometimes outsiders like the Iron Wolves saw problems that insiders preferred to ignore. The meeting on Sunday drew over 300 people to a church basement that seated 200 comfortably and 300 when people stood along the walls and sat on the floor. The Iron Wolves sat together near the front leather vests among Sunday clothes, visible and self-conscious, but present because showing up mattered even when it was uncomfortable. Father Marcus opened with prayer that acknowledged suffering and demanded justice in equal measure, then turned the microphone over to a series of speakers who'd been waiting for someone to create space for truth-telling that school boards and police departments hadn't allowed. DeWal Walsh spoke about Maya's trauma, about the psychiatric impact of assault and public humiliation and ongoing harassment. Sarah Chen detailed the legal case, the evidence of premeditation, the school's systematic failure to protect students. Elena Martinez apologized publicly for her initial reporting and committed to ongoing coverage that prioritized truth over access to powerful sources. Mike Torres, Brandon's former teammate, stood at the microphone looking terrified but determined. I was there when Brandon planned it. He showed me the clippers. Said his dad would protect him. Said the school wouldn't do anything because his family donates $500,000 a year. I tried to stop him, but I was scared. I'm not scared anymore. His testimony opened floodgates. 3 other students came forward with stories of being bullied by Brandon over years of reporting to administrators who did nothing of watching patterns repeat because the school prioritized donor relationships over student safety. A former teacher described being fired after documenting Brandon's behavior after refusing to modify grades for students whose parents had connections. Jenna Parks showed the full, unedited footage she'd captured from her phone, the angle that made Brandon's violence and Maya's terror undeniable, that showed exactly how long Mrs. Lynn had taken to respond and how many students had filmed rather than helped. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimony devastating. And when Superintendent James Worthington, who'd been sitting in the back trying to appear concerned while actually calculating damage control, attempted to claim the video was out of context, Father Marcus cut him off with the kind of moral authority that even institutional power couldn't ignore. Mr. Worthington, you received $250,000 from the Cole family, is that correct? Worthington went pale. That was a legitimate donation to the scholarship fund. Father Marcus's expression was gentle and implacable. Coincidentally made after Richard Cole's son enrolled in your school, and now you're protecting that son while his victim is in psychiatric care. Does that seem like appropriate stewardship of children's welfare? The crowd turned hostile. Questions became accusations. Worthington fled through a side exit while parents demanded his resignation and independent oversight of the school district. A vote was taken. Should there be an external investigation of Grayson Academy's administration and anti-bullying policies? The result was unanimous, yes. Richard Cole's response came via press conference the next morning, standing outside his office, surrounded by cameras trying to control a narrative that had already escaped him. This is mob justice, vigilantism. My son made a mistake, a teenage error in judgment, and now people are trying to destroy him and our family with lies and distortion. I will not allow it. We're filing defamation lawsuits against the Iron Wolves, MC Rose Carter, Elena Martinez, and anyone else who has participated in this campaign of harassment. But the threats rang hollow because the tide had already turned, because once enough people decided to look at something clearly, the spin stopped working, because institutions that had ignored individual complaints couldn't ignore collective outrage. By Wednesday, the State Board of Education had placed Grayson Academy under external review. The Illinois Attorney General had opened formal investigations into Richard Cole's business practices and potential corruption. Detective Anderson, who'd wanted to pursue the case from the beginning, but had been blocked by Officer Bradley and Chief Cooper, was reassigned with full authority to investigate both the assault and the arson. And on Thursday morning, as Maya was being discharged from psychiatric care with medication and a therapy schedule, and a safety plan that acknowledged she would have bad days but now had tools to survive them unmarked car with two men inside pulled up outside their apartment building. Rose noticed them immediately, instincts from her old life recognizing surveillance when she saw it. The men wore Iron King's patches visible when they lit cigarettes, made no effort to be subtle because subtlety wasn't the point. The point was intimidation. She called Hawk while hustling Maya back inside, voice tight with controlled panic. "We're being followed. Iron Kings." Two guys in a dark blue sedan parked across the street. "Can you get to the warehouse?" "Not safely. They're watching the building." Hawk's response was immediate. "Stay there, lock the doors. We're coming to you, all of us." 23 motorcycles arrived at the Carter apartment building within 30 minutes, parking in formation that surrounded the dark blue sedan and made it clear that Iron Kings weren't the only ones who could show force. The two men in the car looked at being outnumbered 10-1 and decided discretion was preferable to confrontation, drove away with the kind of casual menace that promised this wasn't over. Hawk escorted Rose and Maya back to the warehouse where they would stay under protection until the threat was neutralized or eliminated. Maya had been through too much, had come too close to being lost for anyone to take chances with her safety. That night, with Maya sleeping in a back room on a cot surrounded by sleeping bags and spare motorcycle parts, Rose stood with Hawk outside the warehouse, looking at stars that were mostly obscured by light pollution, trying to make sense of how protecting her daughter had led to this job loss and CPS investigation and arson and assassination surveillance, and her 14-year-old nearly dying from suffering that accumulated like poison. "I dragged you all into this." Rose's voice was quiet, defeated. "You should have let us handle it quietly." Hawk turned to look at her, expression serious in the darkness. "Handling it quietly is how this has gone on for years. How many kids before Maya? How many that we'll never know about because they stayed silent and suffered alone?" He gestured back toward the warehouse where Maya slept. "She asked for help. That takes more courage than most adults have. And what happened to her after that's not because she asked. That's because powerful people protect themselves by destroying anyone who threatens their control. So what happens now?" Rose asked the question that had no good answer. "Cole's hired killers. We're living in a warehouse. My daughter almost died. When does this end?" Hawk's answer was simple and absolute. "When we win." The surveillance didn't stop after the Iron Wolves escorted Rose and Maya to the warehouse. For 3 days, unmarked cars circled the block at irregular intervals. Different vehicles, but same threatening presence, making it clear that Derek Snake Morrison and his Iron King's MC hadn't been hired for a one-time intimidation, but for sustained pressure designed to break resolve through accumulated fear. On the 4th day, the escalation came. Rose was walking from her car to the warehouse entrance at 2:30 p.m., returning from a job interview at a hardware store that had gone better than expected when two motorcycles pulled up from the alley. Two men, Iron King's patches visible, approaching fast with hands reaching toward their waistbands in movements that Rose's old instincts recognized immediately as precursors to violence. Nina Viper Santos, monitoring security cameras from inside the warehouse, saw them half a second before they reached for weapons. Her voice cut through the warehouse like a klaxon. "Rose down." Rose hit the pavement as gunshots cracked through cold November air, 3 rounds that struck the brick wall behind where her head had been moments before, chunks of masonry exploding outward in puffs of red dust. The shooters were already fleeing by the time Hawk and Ghost and Leo burst through the warehouse door, but security cameras had captured everything: faces, license plates, the weapons, the attempted murder that had crossed every line that separated intimidation from felony. Detective Anderson, who'd been waiting for something concrete enough to overcome departmental politics and Chief Cooper's reluctance, received the security footage within 15 minutes. Within an hour, he had arrest warrants. Within 4 hours, both shooters were in custody, and Derek Snake Morrison was being questioned about conspiracy to commit murder. Snake was 45 years old and had survived 3 decades in criminal motorcycle clubs by understanding when to fight and when to negotiate. Sitting in an interrogation room with Detective Anderson showing him video evidence of his members attempting to kill a woman in broad daylight, Snake made calculations about loyalty versus self-preservation and came to the conclusion that professional criminals throughout history eventually reached the person who talked first, got the best deal. Richard Cole hired me. Snake's voice was flat transactional. 50,000 to burn the warehouse. Another 100 to scare the mother and daughter. He said make them back off or make them disappear. Detective Anderson, who had been a cop for 18 years and thought he'd seen every flavor of human corruption, felt his stomach turn at the casual way Snake described being hired to murder civilians. You have proof of this phone records. Text messages, bank transfers. Snake leaned back in his chair. I'll give you everything. But I want immunity on the murder for hire charges. I'll do the arson, but I'm not taking life in prison because some rich lawyer wanted to protect his brat kid. The deal was made. Snake would testify against Richard Cole in exchange for reduced charges, 15 years for arson, and conspiracy instead of life for attempted murder. His 2 members who'd actually pulled the triggers weren't offered deals, would face the full weight of attempted first-degree murder charges. But Snake's testimony gave prosecutors what they needed: direct evidence linking Richard Cole to criminal conspiracy. The arrest happened at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, deliberately timed for maximum humiliation. 8 federal agents and 4 state police officers surrounded Richard Cole's house in Riverside's most exclusive neighborhood, executed search warrants that had been approved by federal judges, who weren't subject to local political pressure, removed computers and phones and documents, while neighbors watched from windows and filmed from driveways. Richard Cole was let out in handcuffs, expensive suit, and carefully maintained dignity, undermined by the perp walk that would appear on every news channel by noon. His wife Jennifer watched from the doorway, expression unreadable, making no move to follow or protest. Brandon watched from his bedroom window and felt the careful architecture of his entire world collapse into rubble. The charges were extensive solicitation of arson, conspiracy to commit murder, witness intimidation, obstruction of justice, corruption of public officials. Officer Tom Bradley was arrested the same morning on related charges, caught in the same net that Richard's hubris had constructed around himself. At the warehouse, Rose watched the news coverage with Maya beside her and felt something that wasn't quite satisfaction, because there was too much damage that couldn't be undone by arrests, but was maybe the beginning of closure, the sense that the universe occasionally bent toward justice if enough people pushed hard enough in the right direction. It's really over. Maya's question was small, tentative, carrying the disbelief of someone who'd learned not to trust good news. The criminal part is, Rose pulled her daughter close. Now comes the harder part. Healing. That takes longer. The trials began in February, 3 months after Brandon had grabbed Maya's hair, in room 8B, in courtrooms that became theaters for examining exactly how corruption functioned when wealthy people decided their children were above consequences. Brandon Cole appeared in juvenile court, first tried as a minor, despite the severity of his actions, because 15 years old meant the system still believed in rehabilitation over pure punishment. His father, facing his own criminal charges, couldn't attend. His mother sat in the front row looking hollowed out, wearing sunglasses inside, because the press had been relentless, and her face was too recognizable now. The prosecution presented video evidence from multiple angles. Jenna Park's unedited footage showing the assault in full context, Brandon's own TikTok post with its triumphant caption, and photo of him holding Maya's hair, like trophy security footage from school cameras, showing Brandon's friends laughing and filming while Maya bled. They presented the group chat where 347 students had voted for him to shave Maya's head, presented his message saying bet brought, Clippers room 8B, presented the 2 months of escalating harassment that preceded the assault. They called Mike Torres to the stand, and he testified about Brandon explicitly stating that his father would protect him, that the school wouldn't act because of donation money, that consequences didn't apply to people with the right last name. Called Mrs. Lynn, who admitted she'd frozen for 43 seconds because she couldn't process what she was seeing, admitted the delay was inexcusable, admitted she'd failed in her duty to protect a student. Called Maya herself, who walked into the courtroom wearing a beanie over hair that had grown back in uneven patches, who sat in the witness box and answered questions in a voice that shook but didn't break, who looked at Brandon across the courtroom and said the words that would follow him forever. "You made me want to die. That's what your prank did." Brandon's defense attorney, not his father but a public defender, assigned after Richard's arrest, had frozen the family's assets, tried to argue diminished capacity, social media addiction, peer pressure, anything that might mitigate the severity of calculated cruelty that had been documented in excruciating detail. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the judge, an older woman who'd spent 30 years on the bench and had seen every permutation of teenage violence, wasn't interested in excuses. The verdict came after 4 days of testimony, guilty on all counts: assault and battery, distribution of child exploitation imagery, cyber harassment. The sentence was harsh by juvenile standards, but appropriate for the harm: 18 months in juvenile detention, mandatory therapy 3 times per week, 200 hours of community service upon release, probation until age 21, permanent record that would affect college admissions and employment for years to come. Brandon's mother collapsed, sobbing in the front row. Brandon himself showed no emotion, face blank, in the way people's faces went blank when reality exceeded their capacity to process it. As he was led away in handcuffs that seemed too large for his wrists, he glanced back once at Maya and mouthed 2 words: "I'm sorry." Maya didn't acknowledge him, just stood and walked out of the courtroom with her mother and Hawk, feeling not triumph, but exhausted relief that this part was finally over. Richard Cole's trial was federal prosecuted with resources that local cases rarely received, tried in Chicago, with jury selection that took 3 weeks to find 12 people who hadn't already formed opinions from news coverage. The charges were serious enough to guarantee prison time if convicted: solicitation of arson, conspiracy to commit murder, witness intimidation, obstruction of justice, corruption of a public official. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They presented Snake's testimony about being hired to burn the warehouse and frighten or kill Rose and Maya. Presented phone records showing calls between Richard and Snake's burner phone. Presented bank records showing transfers from Richard's shell company to Officer Tom Bradley, documented the payments that had bought police protection for 6 months. Presented the arson investigator's report, multiple ignition points, gasoline accelerant, professional execution that pointed to criminal organization rather than random vandalism. Presented the security footage of the assassination attempt, the 2 Iron Kings members who tried to kill Rose, captured in high definition, pulling weapons and firing at a woman whose only crime was protecting her daughter. Called Snake Morrison to the stand, and he testified with the flat affect of someone reciting facts he'd lived through. Richard Cole had approached him at a fundraiser, had eventually asked about discouraging a motorcycle club, had paid $50,000 for the arson, and offered another $100,000 to scare away or eliminate Rose and Maya Carter. Snake provided dates, amounts, conversations, details that only someone directly involved could know. The defense tried to discredit Snake as unreliable witness with everything to gain from lying, but the documentary evidence supported every claim he made. Tried to argue that Richard had been protecting his son from vigilantes, that any reasonable father would take extreme measures. But the jury looked at video of attempted murder and found that argument grotesque rather than sympathetic. The prosecution saved their most effective witness for last. Rose Carter herself, who took the stand wearing simple dress and the kind of dignity that came from refusing to be ashamed of doing the right thing. She described finding Maya in the warehouse with her hair hacked off and blood on her scalp. Described asking the Iron Wolves for help because the school had done nothing. Described losing her job and facing CPS investigation, and having her apartment surveilled by criminals hired by a man who thought money exempted him from accountability. Described finding her daughter on the bathroom floor holding pills, coming within minutes of losing the only person in the world who mattered to her, not because of the original assault, but because of the systematic campaign of harassment and intimidation that Richard Cole had orchestrated to protect his son from consequences. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous on every count: guilty. The sentencing came 2 days later. The judge, a federal appointee with 23 years on the bench, spoke directly to Richard before announcing the sentence. "Mr. Cole, you were entrusted with upholding the law. Instead, you corrupted it. You used wealth and connections to create a system where your son could victimize others without accountability. And when a mother sought protection for her daughter through legal channels, You hired criminals to intimidate, harm, and potentially murder them. You represent everything wrong with a justice system that treats the wealthy and powerful as above consequences. 8 to 12 years federal prison on the conspiracy charges. 5 years consecutive for witness intimidation. 3 years consecutive for obstruction. No possibility of parole before serving minimum sentence. Richard Cole, disbarred and financially ruined by legal fees and frozen assets, would be 71 years old when eligible for release. In the gallery, Rose held Maya's hand and felt tears running down her face, not from joy, but from the overwhelming exhaustion of fighting so hard for so long to achieve something that should have been automatic accountability for people who hurt children. Officer Tom Bradley pleaded guilty to corruption charges in exchange for testimony against other officers who had taken Cole family money over the years. 3 additional cops were arrested, including a captain in the department who'd been protecting Bradley and steering investigations away from Cole interests. Chief Marcus Cooper, who'd never taken money but had looked the other way when his subordinates did resign rather than face criminal charges, took early retirement with reduced pension. The civil trial against Grayson Academy happened simultaneously prosecuted by Sarah Chen with the controlled fury of someone who'd spent 6 years fighting institutional corruption that sacrificed vulnerable people to protect powerful ones. She presented evidence of the school's systematic failure, 2 months of documented harassment that teachers had witnessed and administrators had ignored Principal Wheeler's attempt to handle the assault internally rather than calling police the suspension of Maya. While Brandon remained in classes, the school board members who'd received legal services from Cole's firm and voted accordingly presented testimony from former teachers who'd been fired for documenting behavior that reflected poorly on donor families, from students who'd reported bullying, only to have complaints disappear from official records, from parents who tried to address concerns only to be told their children were being too sensitive. The school district, facing overwhelming evidence and the possibility of a jury trial that would expose even more corruption, settled for $850,000, $500,000 to Maya in trust fund for college and ongoing therapy, $350,000 to the Iron Wolves MC Anti-Bullying Fund that would be used to implement protective programs in schools throughout Illinois. Additional consequences came swiftly. Principal Wheeler was terminated for cause, her teaching license suspended pending ethics investigation. Superintendent James Worthington resigned under pressure before he could be formally removed. 4 school board members who'd been implicated in the corruption resigned, replaced by community elections that prioritized actual child welfare over donor relationships. An independent oversight board was installed, parents and teachers and students given actual voice in policy decisions. Zero-tolerance anti-bullying protocols were implemented with third-party monitoring. Teachers were protected from retaliation for reporting problems. The scholarship fund was restructured to ensure donations couldn't be used as leverage to excuse student behavior. Grayson Academy, or what would soon be renamed Jefferson Academy, to distance itself from the scandal, became test case for what schools looked like when they actually prioritized student safety over institutional reputation. Brandon Cole sat in juvenile detention in a facility 3 hours from Riverside and tried to understand who he was without followers and filters and the constant validation of strangers clicking heart icons on content he created from other people's suffering. The first month was the hardest. He went through social media withdrawal that manifested physically: anxiety attacks, insomnia, the phantom sensation of his phone vibrating in a pocket where he no longer carried a phone. His therapy sessions with Dr. Richard Hammond were mandatory 3 times per week, 45 minutes of sitting in uncomfortable chairs talking about things Brandon had spent 15 years avoiding. Why he needed attention so desperately that he'd hurt people to get it. Why his father's approval had mattered more than his own sense of right and wrong. Why making Maya suffer had felt powerful in the moment and empty immediately after. The breakthrough came in month 4 during a session where Dr. Hammond asked a question Brandon had been dodging for weeks. Why did you assault Maya specifically? Brandon's first answer was reflexive. I don't know. It was just funny. But Dr. Hammond didn't accept deflection anymore. Try again. 200,000 people followed you. You had everything. Why did humiliating one girl matter? The silence stretched for 3 full minutes before Brandon found words adequate to the truth he'd been avoiding. Because people only cared about me when I did something crazy. Every video had to top the last. The algorithm rewarded escalation. And when I saw that poll with 347 people voting for me to do it, it felt like power. Like I mattered because I could make something happen that everyone would talk about. "And how does it feel now?" Dr. Hammond asked quietly. Brandon looked at his hands at the orange jumpsuit he wore at the concrete walls decorated with motivational posters that rang hollow. "Like I destroyed someone's life for views. Like I'm a monster." "You made monstrous choices." Dr. Hammond's distinction was careful, precise. But people aren't just their worst actions. You can choose differently going forward. The question is whether you will. The work was hard and slow, and frequently involved setbacks where old patterns reasserted themselves, where Brandon found himself thinking about how many views a certain story would get before remembering he couldn't post stories anymore, couldn't reduce life to content, couldn't treat people as extras in his personal reality show. But slowly and possibly, something changed. He started reading books, actual books, instead of scrolling through feeds. Started participating in group therapy, where other teenagers shared their own stories of violence and cruelty and the long road toward becoming better than their worst moments. Started writing letters first to his mother, apologizing for everything his selfishness had cost her, then to Mike Torres, thanking him for trying to stop the assault even when Brandon had ignored those warnings. And finally, after 6 months of therapy and countless drafted versions, to Maya. The letter was handwritten on lined paper, words carefully formed, because Brandon had written dozens of drafts before arriving at language that felt adequate to the enormity of what he'd done. "Maya, I know sorry isn't enough. I know what I did was evil, and that saying I'm sorry doesn't erase the harm I caused you. But I want you to know that I am sorry more than I can express in a letter. For 2 months, I made your life miserable with videos and harassment and deliberate humiliation. Then I assaulted you in front of our entire class, filmed it, posted it online, and treated your suffering like entertainment. That was unforgivable. My therapist says I hurt you because I was addicted to validation, because my dad taught me that power meant making people weaker than me suffer, because I believed follower counts measured my worth as a person. None of that excuses what I did. You didn't deserve any of it. You were just trying to exist. I made that impossible. I gave you trauma you'll carry forever. I drove you to a place where death felt preferable to living with what I'd done to you. I'm in therapy now, learning that being broken doesn't give me permission to break others. Learning that real strength is protection, not cruelty. Learning to recognize when I'm repeating patterns my father taught me and choosing different behaviors even when old ones feel natural. I don't expect forgiveness. I'm not sure I deserve it. But I want you to know that I see clearly now what I did. I'm ashamed of who I was, and I'm working every day to become someone better. I hope someday you can be happy again without the shadow of what I did hanging over you. I hope you can trust that not everyone who hurt you will keep hurting you. You were braver than I ever was. You stood up and told the truth even when it was terrifying. Because of you, my father can't hurt anyone anymore. Because of you, I'm getting help I needed but didn't know how to ask for. Because of you, students at Grayson are safer. Thank you for being brave. I'm sorry I made you have to be. Brandon Cole. The letter was delivered to Maya through proper channels, read first by Rose and Sarah Chen and Dr. Walsh to ensure it wasn't manipulative or self-serving, confirmed to represent genuine progress rather than performance. When Maya finally read it 3 weeks after it was written, sitting in her therapist's office with Dr. Walsh beside her, she felt something complicated that wasn't forgiveness, but wasn't hate either. She folded the letter carefully and put it in the box where she kept important things the guardian angel pin stitch had given her that first day at the warehouse, photographs of her father. She barely remembered drawings she'd made in therapy, evidence that she was building a life from fragments that had been scattered across a classroom floor. Maya's healing was not linear. There were good days when she could imagine a future that included college and career and relationships built on something other than trauma. And there were bad days when she couldn't leave her room, when the panic attacks came without warning, when she looked in the mirror and saw only the girl whose hair had been cut while people laughed and filmed. Dr. Walsh, who Maya saw twice a week for the first 6 months and then once a week after that, helped her understand that healing wasn't about returning to who she'd been before the assault, but about building someone new from the ruins of that person, someone who carried scars but wasn't defined by them. The PTSD would probably never completely disappear, Dr. Walsh explained gently, Loud noises might always make you flinch. Classrooms might always feel unsafe. You might always have moments where you're transported back to that day, but those moments will get shorter and less frequent, and you'll develop tools to manage them. The tools came slowly, grounding techniques for when panic made her feel like she was drowning, medication to help her sleep without nightmares, cognitive behavioral therapy to challenge thoughts that told her she was worthless or that everything was her fault, EMDR to process traumatic memories so they stopped replaying on constant loop. 6 months after the assault, Maya made a decision that felt like reclaiming power from hands that had taken it. She cut her hair. Not because someone forced her, but because she chose it. Went to a salon that partnered with the Iron Wolves, specifically to serve abuse survivors, sat in the chair, and said the words that announced ownership of her own body: short, edgy, strong, like I'm not hiding anymore. The stylist, a woman named Carmen, who had her own history with violence and survival, cut Maya's hair into a platinum pixie that was bold and beautiful and entirely Maya's choice. When it was finished, Maya looked in the mirror and saw not the girl who'd been victimized, but the young woman who'd survived, who'd asked for help, who'd testified in court, who'd chosen to keep living even when death had seemed easier. She took a photo and posted it to the TikTok account she'd created during recovery, Bold and Brave, with a caption that would be quoted in anti-bullying campaigns across the country. They cut my hair to humiliate me. I cut it to reclaim it. My body, my rules. Hashtag bold and brave. The post went viral within hours. 50,000 likes by evening. Comments pouring in from survivors sharing their own stories, from teenagers who'd been bullied finding hope in Maya's resilience, from parents thanking her for giving voice to suffering their own children had experienced. Within weeks, @Bold and Brave had grown to 75,000 followers, more than Brandon had ever achieved through cruelty. Maya posted regularly self-esteem tips drawn from therapy resources for bullying victims, interviews with other survivors, educational content about trauma and recovery, and the long road toward healing. She became an accidental advocate, speaking at schools and churches and community centers about her experience, always ending with the same message: ask for help. Find people who see you whole. You are not alone. The catchphrase that emerged from her content, "They cut my hair, but not my courage," appeared on t-shirts and murals, and social media bios became shorthand for the idea that victimization didn't equal helplessness, that surviving meant something, that the people who hurt you didn't get to write the ending of your story. In September, 8 months after the assault, Maya enrolled at Lincoln Academy, a public school 3 towns over, that had no connection to Grayson or the Cole family or the history that haunted Riverside. The first day was terrifying. Walking into unfamiliar hallways carrying the weight of being that girl, whose story everyone knew because it had been national news. But something unexpected happened. Students who recognized her didn't mock or avoid her. They approached carefully, respectfully, said variations of the same thing: "I saw what happened. That was brave. I'm glad you're here." She made friends, real friends. Jenna Park had transferred to Lincoln to stay close, providing continuity from Maya's old life. But new friendships formed: two Rachel and Priya and Marcus students who knew her story but chose to know Maya herself, who invited her to lunch and study groups and weekend hangouts, who normalized the experience of being a survivor rather than treating her like she was fragile or damaged. Her teachers at Lincoln had been briefed about her trauma, knew to avoid calling on her unexpectedly or putting her in situations that might trigger panic, but they also held her to the same academic standards as everyone else, because treating her normally was part of healing. She was a student who'd been hurt, not a victim who needed constant accommodation. By winter, Maya had joined the school's poetry club, and the debate team had discovered that speaking about difficult topics in structured environments felt empowering rather than frightening, had begun to imagine a future that included Northwestern University and a psychology degree, and eventually helping other trauma survivors navigate the aftermath of violence. The nightmares still came sometimes. The panic attacks happened less frequently, but hadn't disappeared. She still had days where leaving her room felt impossible, where the weight of everything that had happened crushed her flat and made breathing feel like work. But she also had days where she laughed with friends, where she lost herself in books or music or the simple pleasure of being 14 and not thinking about trauma for hours at a time. Had days where the good outweighed the bad, where surviving felt like victory rather than just not dying. 15 months after the assault, Maya received a request through Dr. Walsh, Brandon's therapist, was asking if Maya would be willing to participate in a restorative justice meeting, a supervised conversation, where victim and perpetrator could speak directly in a setting designed to promote healing for both parties. Dr. Walsh supported the idea if Maya wanted it, noting that victim-offender dialogue could be powerful for trauma survivors when done carefully with appropriate safeguards. But she emphasized that this was entirely Maya's choice, that she owed Brandon nothing, that healing didn't require forgiveness or reconciliation. Maya thought about it for a week. Read Brandon's letter again. Reread the apology he'd written 6 months into his detention. Talked to her mother and to Hawk and to her friends about whether she wanted to face the person who'd hurt her. Finally decided yes, not for Brandon's benefit, but for her own closure, for the chance to say things directly that she'd never been able to say in court, for the possibility of transforming Brandon from monster in her memory into something more human and therefore less haunting. The meeting happened at a neutral location in Chicago, a therapy office where neither Maya nor Brandon had previous associations. Present were both teens, Dr. Walsh, Dr. Hammond Rose, and Hawk as Maya's support, and Brandon's Aunt Teresa, who'd gained custody after his mother had moved to California to escape the scandal. Brandon arrived in street clothes rather than the orange jumpsuit he'd worn during detention, looked smaller than Maya remembered, shoulders hunched inward, like he was trying to take up less space. His hair had grown out and lost its carefully styled perfection. His face carried none of the smug confidence that had defined him at Grayson. The room was set up carefully, chairs arranged so Maya and Brandon could see each other, but with enough distance that neither felt physically threatened. Tissues on side tables, a meditation bell that either party could ring to pause the conversation if needed. Dr. Hammond opened by establishing ground rules. Maya would speak first, and Brandon would listen without interrupting. Then Brandon could respond, facilitated dialogue rather than confrontation. Both teens had agreed to this structure beforehand. Maya looked at Brandon for the first time in over a year and said the words she'd been practicing in therapy for weeks. "I'm not here to forgive you. I'm here to tell you what you took from me so you understand the real cost of what you did for internet points." Brandon nodded, didn't speak, just listened as Maya detailed the inventory of damage, the months of escalating harassment before the assault, the 43 seconds of frozen terror while he cut her hair and everyone watched and filmed, the hospital visit for scalp wounds, the suspension, while he stayed in school watching her mother lose employment and face CPS investigation and nearly get killed by criminals he'd unwittingly set in motion. Told him about the suicide attempt, about sitting on her bathroom floor with pills in her hand, believing the world would be better without her in it, about the psychiatric hold and the PTSD diagnosis, and the nightmares that still sometimes woke her screaming. Told him about the therapy twice a week and the medication she'd probably take for years, and the panic attacks that came without warning and left her unable to breathe. "You made me a joke." Maya's voice was steady despite tears. "You made me want to die. You made my mother watch me almost die. You destroyed my sense of safety in the world. And you did all of it for views, for validation from strangers who don't know you and never will." When she finished, the room was silent, except for the sound of Brandon crying. Not performative tears, but genuine anguish at confronting the human cost of cruelty he'd committed. He wiped his eyes with shaking hands and looked at Maya with something that might have been genuine remorse. "I'm sorry." His voice broke on the words. "Really, truly sorry. There's no excuse for what I did. I destroyed you for engagement metrics. I made you want to die because I was addicted to attention. That's unforgivable." Maya studied him, this boy who'd been monster in her nightmares, seeing instead a 15-year-old who'd made catastrophic choices and was genuinely trying to understand why and become something different. "Why did you do it?" The question Maya had been carrying for over a year. "Why me?" Brandon took a breath, clearly drawing on months of therapy to find honest answer. "Because you were there. Because 347 people voted for it, and I felt powerful being able to give them what they wanted. Because my dad taught me that control meant hurting people weaker than me. Because I measured my worth in follower counts, and your suffering was just content that could get me to the next milestone." He paused, wiped his eyes again. "I didn't see you as human, just as opportunity. And that's the most monstrous thing about it. You had feelings in life and people who loved you, and I treated all of that like it didn't matter compared to my need for validation. Maya felt something shift inside her, not forgiveness exactly, but the beginning of understanding that hurt people. Hurt people that Brandon had been as trapped in his own patterns as she'd been trapped in hers. That healing required seeing perpetrators as human rather than evil, because evil was too simple and humanity was complicated. She stood up, walked closer until she was within arm's reach of Brandon, extended her hand. Apology accepted. Her voice was firm. But now you prove it. Not to me, to every kid being bullied right now. Use what you learned. Make something good from this disaster. Brandon took her hand, shook it once brief contact that acknowledged something shifting between them. Not friendship, not forgiveness, but closure. Recognition that they'd both survived something terrible and could choose how that survival shaped them. They talked for another hour, facilitated by both therapists, talking about their respective healing journeys and the work they were each doing to become better than their worst moments. When the session ended, both teens left exhausted, but somehow lighter, like setting down weight they had been carrying for too long. Outside in the parking lot, Rose hugged her daughter tight. "I'm proud of you." That took more courage than most adults have. Maya leaned into her mother's embrace and felt something close to peace. He's not a monster, just a person who made terrible choices and is trying to do better. Hawk, who'd watched the entire session from the back of the room, nodded approval. That's the hardest thing to learn, that people are complicated, and that sometimes giving them chance to change actually works. 18 months after Maya Rose Carter walked into room 8B, believing the worst part of her day would be a science presentation, the Iron Wolves MC held their second annual Ride for the Voiceless, a charity motorcycle rally that had grown from local event to statewide phenomenon, drawing over 500 riders and raising $200,000 for anti-bullying programs. Maya rode her own motorcycle, a Harley-Davidson Sportster, customized by Rose with pink wolves painted on the tank. And Maya's catchphrase, "They cut my hair but not my courage," lettered across the fender. She wore a leather vest that matched the Iron Wolves, but had been specially made for her black leather with pink accents and patches commemorating her survival. Behind her rode Hawk and the entire Iron Wolves chapter, their numbers having grown to 37 members, as the club's reputation had transformed from suspicious to heroic, as people understood that Brotherhood could mean protection rather than violence. Rose rode beside her daughter, had started riding again after 15 years away, had discovered that the world she'd run from could be chosen on different terms. Father Marcus O'Brien rode in a sidecar attached to Ghost's motorcycle, laughing with pure joy at the absurdity and beauty of a Catholic priest riding with a motorcycle club to raise money for child protection. His presence had legitimized the Iron Wolves in ways legal victories never could have had, given them moral authority that communities recognized and respected. The ride wound through Riverside past Grayson Academy, which had been renamed Jefferson Academy, and bore a plaque near the entrance room 8B, Courage Memorial, in honor of survivors who found their voice. Past the warehouse that had been rebuilt with donations from across the state, now home to the Iron Wolves and their anti-bullying program. Past Rose's apartment, which they'd been able to keep despite job loss because the community had rallied. People lined the streets, watching the procession, not with fear anymore, but with respect. Cars honked in support. Parents held signs, "We stand with Maya and protect our kids," in bold and brave. The town that had initially dismissed her suffering had been transformed by her refusal to stay silent. At the rally's endpoint in Lincoln Park, Maya was invited to speak to the assembled crowd of over 2,000 people, riders and families and students, and community members who'd come to show support or learn about anti-bullying resources, or simply witness what collective action looked like when enough people decided that protecting children mattered more than protecting institutions. Maya walked to the microphone wearing her vest and her confidence and her platinum pixie cut that had become her signature, looked out at faces watching her with respect rather than mockery, and spoke the truth that had taken 18 months to fully understand. 18 months ago, I walked into a classroom thinking the worst thing I'd face was a bad grade. I left without my hair, without my dignity, with my soul in pieces. What broke me wasn't the clippers. It was the silence of people who saw and did nothing. She paused, letting the crowd absorb that reality. I thought family was just blood. My mom taught me it's not. Family is who drops everything when you need them, who stands in the cold before dawn just to tell you you're not alone, who fights systems that failed you, who shows up. She gestured to Rose and Hawk standing at the side of the stage. Those two taught me that. This community taught me that. Every person here who chose to care about a stranger's daughter taught me that. Maya's voice strengthened. To anyone watching who's going through hell right now, don't wait for your hair to fall to ask for help. Don't carry suffering alone because you're afraid of burdening people. Real family shows up. Real community protects its own. Find your people. Tell your truth. And to my bully, Maya looked at the back of the crowd where Brandon stood with his aunt, having been released from detention 3 months ago, and now working community service with the Iron Wolves anti-bullying program. Thank you for proving that villains can become allies. Your change inspired others. That matters. She finished with the line that had become anthem, "They cut my hair, but not my courage." The crowd erupted, 2,000 people chanting it back to her, the words echoing across the park, becoming the kind of collective affirmation that survivors needed to hear, that suffering wasn't shameful, that asking for help was brave, that healing was possible, even when damage felt permanent. In the months following, the rally, transformations that had begun continued accelerating outward in ripples that touched lives far beyond Riverside. Maya Rose Carter, at 16, was accepted early admission to Northwestern University's psychology program, planning to study trauma counseling and eventually work with young survivors. Her TikTok account, at Bold and Brave, had grown to 180,000 followers, and she'd published an essay in Teen Vogue titled "When Assault Goes Viral, A Survivor's Guide to Healing in Public," that was shared over 100,000 times and assigned in high school classes across the country. She still had PTSD, still took medication, still saw Dr. Walsh monthly for maintenance therapy. But she'd learned to manage her trauma rather than being managed by it, had discovered that broken things could be mended into something stronger than they'd been originally. Rose Carter had opened Raven Customs, a motorcycle customization shop next to the Iron Wolves warehouse, specializing in bikes for women and abuse survivors. The business was thriving, drawing clients from across Illinois who wanted motorcycles that represented freedom rather than fear. She'd started dating Leo Chains Torres, the relationship developing slowly as both navigated the complications of building something new from foundations strengthened by shared crisis. She'd reconnected fully with the Iron Wolves, attended meetings, and rode in rallies, and discovered that the world she'd fled 10 years ago had evolved into something different from what had killed Daniel. Learned that communities could change, that people could learn, that sometimes returning to the past meant finding the future you'd been running toward all along. Brandon Cole, at 17, had completed his detention sentence and was working full-time with the Iron Wolves anti-bullying program while attending community college. He'd lost all his social media followers, had quit Instagram and TikTok entirely, was working toward degree in social work with specialization in adolescent behavioral health. His relationship with his mother was slowly rebuilding, complicated by years of her enabling his worst behaviors, but genuine in their mutual desire to be better than they'd been. He saw Dr. Hammond weekly, would probably be in therapy for years, understood that redemption was process rather than destination. He'd spoken at juvenile detention facilities about social media addiction and the cost of treating people as content. Had testified before state legislature about the need for better digital literacy education and platforms' responsibility for algorithmic amplification of harmful content. Had become unexpected advocate for restorative justice, proving through his own transformation that punishment alone changed nothing if it wasn't accompanied by genuine reckoning. His collaboration with Maya remained strictly professional. They appeared together occasionally at speaking events about bullying, and healing their joint testimony powerful, because it showed both sides of harm, what it cost to be victimized, and what it took to genuinely change after being perpetrator. But they weren't friends, would probably never be friends, and that was appropriate because forgiveness didn't require friendship, and healing didn't require pretending damage hadn't happened. Richard Cole was serving year 3 of his federal sentence at medium security prison in Indiana. His legal career destroyed his family, scattered his comfortable life, replaced by institutional routine, and the particular isolation of being wealthy man in prison where wealth meant nothing. He would be eligible for parole in 5 years if he demonstrated genuine rehabilitation, but parole boards were notoriously skeptical of white-collar criminals who showed remorse only after being caught. Officer Tom Bradley was in year 2 of a 6-year sentence for corruption. Chief Marcus Cooper had retired in disgrace, his pension reduced, his reputation destroyed. The Riverside Police Department had undergone complete restructuring, new leadership, mandatory ethics training, citizen oversight board that reviewed complaints and had actual power to discipline officers. Grayson Academy, now Jefferson Academy, had become model for what schools could be when they prioritized student safety over institutional reputation. The Angel Watch program, pioneered by the Iron Wolves, had been implemented in 47 schools across Illinois, with another 63 districts in 8 states piloting similar initiatives. Bullying incidents at Jefferson had dropped 82% in the 18 months since Maya's assault. Physical altercations had declined to 0 in the past year. Student attendance was up 23% because kids who'd been avoiding school out of fear discovered it could be safe space rather than war zone. Teacher retention was 100% for first time in the school's history, with waiting lists for positions at institution that had previously struggled to maintain adequate staffing. And across Illinois, Sarah's Law, named not after Maya but after the first teacher who'd been fired for reporting Brandon's behavior, had passed with bipartisan support, mandating independent audits of school board finances, protecting whistleblowers who reported corruption, requiring that bullying complaints be tracked in tamper-proof systems. 12 other states were considering similar legislation inspired by small-town corruption case that had exposed patterns existing everywhere. Systems prioritized power over protection. The National Anti-Bullying Summit in Chicago drew over 4,000 attendees, educators and parents and survivors and advocates and policymakers trying to figure out how to protect children in an era where cruelty could be filmed and shared and monetized, and where institutions still struggled to respond effectively. Maya Rose Carter, at 16, was invited as keynote speaker, standing on a stage in front of a room full of people who'd come specifically to hear her story, wearing her leather vest and her confidence, and the particular authority that came from surviving something terrible and choosing to transform it into purpose. 18 months ago, she began, voice steady and clear. I walked into school thinking the worst thing I'd face was a math test. I left without my hair, without my dignity, with my soul in pieces. But what broke me wasn't the assault itself, it was the silence. The 43 seconds while adults watched. The months where teachers saw and did nothing. The system that protected my bully while punishing me for having people who cared. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. I thought family was just blood. My mom taught me it's not. Family is who drops everything when you need them, who stands in the cold just to tell you you're not alone, who fights systems that failed you, who documents everything and builds cases, and stays until the end. She gestured to where Rose and Hawk sat in the front row, both in their Iron Wolves vests, visible proof that family came in unexpected forms. Those two taught me that. This community taught me that. 63 motorcycles taught me that. Maya's voice strengthened with each word. To anyone watching who's going through hell right now, ask for help. Find people who see you whole. Document everything, because institutions ignore individuals but can't ignore evidence. Use your voice because silence protects abusers. And know that you are not alone, even when it feels like you're drowning. She took breath, delivered the lines she'd practiced, but that still carried weight of lived truth. To the adults in this room, believe kids when they tell you something's wrong. Act immediately instead of waiting for proof that suffering is bad enough to merit intervention. Protect victims instead of institutions, because every day you wait is another day a child suffers alone. And to my bully, Maya looked at Brandon, who stood near the back door, having been invited because his transformation was part of the story. Thank you for proving that people can change. That accountability leads to growth. That admitting you were wrong is harder than staying defensive. Your journey gives me hope that we can break cycles instead of repeating them. She finished with her catchphrase, but added something new. They cut my hair, but not my courage. And my courage is contagious. Pass it on. The standing ovation lasted 4 full minutes. The video of her speech was watched by over 5 million people in the next 72 hours. Comment sections filled with survivors sharing their own stories with teachers, committing to doing better with parents, expressing gratitude for someone finally articulating what their children had lived through. Maya Rose Carter became face of movement she'd never asked to lead, becoming symbol for idea. That surviving meant something, that asking for help was brave, that communities could choose to protect their vulnerable instead of their powerful, that systems could change if enough people demanded they change. 2 years after the assault on a Tuesday morning that should have been ordinary, but felt transformative, Maya and Rose and the entire Iron Wolves chapter gathered at the site where Daniel Ace Carter had died 12 years earlier, a stretch of highway 3 miles outside Riverside, where a curve had proven too sharp, and the rain had made the road too slick, and a motorcycle had crashed, and a man had died, and a family had been shattered. There was a memorial there now, a marker placed by the Iron Wolves the year after Daniel's death, but this morning they were adding something new, a second plaque, bronze and permanent, with words that Rose had spent months perfecting. Daniel Ace Carter, 1977 to 2013. He rode for freedom. He died too young. His daughter learned that family protects its own. Maya Rose Carter survived 2023. She proved that asking for help is strength. Her courage sparked change. Her voice cannot be silenced. Some legacies are inherited, others are earned. Both matter. Rose stood looking at the plaques with tears running down her face, one arm around Maya, who was now almost as tall as she was, the other hand held by Leo, who'd become steady presence in their lives. Hawk stood beside them, massive and protective, surrounded by 37 Iron Wolves who'd come to witness this ceremony. Father Marcus O'Brien performed blessing not just of the memorial, but of the family that had formed around grief and transformed it into purpose. He spoke about Daniel's life and death, about the community he'd helped build, about the daughter he'd never known, who'd inherited his stubbornness and his courage and his absolute refusal to accept injustice. Spoke about Rose, who'd run from this world and then run back to it when her daughter needed protection, who'd discovered that leaving and returning were both acts of love. Spoke about Hawk and the Iron Wolves, who'd kept promise made at a funeral, who'd proven that loyalty meant showing up when it cost something. Spoke about Maya, who'd transformed victimization into advocacy, who'd shown thousands of survivors that their voices mattered, who'd proven that the people who tried to break you didn't get to write the ending of your story. When the ceremony ended, when the crowd began to disperse, Maya stayed behind, looking at the plaques that linked her survival to her father's legacy, that acknowledged both the family she'd been born into and the family she'd found when she needed them most. Hawk approached quietly, stood beside her. Your dad would be proud. Everything you've become, everything you've survived. Maya looked up at him. This man who'd stepped into void left by her father's absence, who'd given her his vest when she was terrified, who'd mobilized an army when she needed protection. Did you know him well? Hawk smiled, the expression carrying years of memories. Knew him better than most. He was stubborn and brave and absolutely refused to let anyone suffer alone. Sounds like someone else I know. Maya leaned against him briefly, allowing herself to be held by the man who'd become something like father in all the ways that mattered. Thank you for everything, for showing up, for not giving up when it got hard. That's what family does. Hawk's answer was simple. We show up, we stay, we fight, always. As they walked back to where the motorcycles waited, Maya felt something settle inside her that had been restless for 2 years. The sense that she'd finally arrived at the place she was meant to be, surrounded by people who'd chosen to love her, carrying legacy that was both inherited and earned, ready to face whatever came next with courage that had been tested and proven unbreakable. Maya Rose Carter stood in her dorm room at Northwestern University, 21 years old, and graduating summa cum laude with degree in psychology and specialization in trauma counseling, looking at the acceptance letter she'd just received from the doctoral program at University of Chicago. Her phone buzzed with texts from Rose. Proud of you, baby girl. Your father would be too. See you at graduation. The whole pack is coming. Maya smiled, could picture exactly what that meant. Rose and Leo, who'd gotten married last year. Hawk and the Iron Wolves chapter that had grown to 63 members across 3 states. Father Marcus, who'd officiated the wedding. Ander Walsh, who'd guided her through years of healing. Even Elena Martinez, who'd become friend after writing truth that helped win justice. Her walls were covered in photos documenting 5 years of transformation, graduation from Lincoln Academy, speaking at state legislature about anti-bullying legislation, standing with Brandon Cole at joint presentation about restorative justice, writing and charity rallies that now drew over 1,000 motorcycles, accepting awards for advocacy work she'd never sought but had grown into. Her TikTok account, and Bold and Brave, had grown to 340,000 followers, had become resource for survivors and educators, and anyone trying to understand how to transform suffering into purpose. Her book, They Cut My Hair, But Not My Courage. A Survivor's Journey had been published 6 months ago, had hit bestseller lists, had been optioned for documentary film that would premiere next year. But what mattered most wasn't the public success or the advocacy or the awards. What mattered was the work she did every Tuesday and Thursday at the campus counseling center, sitting with traumatized students and teaching them what she'd learned, that asking for help was strength, that healing was possible, even when damage felt permanent, that surviving meant something. What mattered was that she could sleep now without nightmares. Most nights could walk into classrooms without panic attacks, could see hair clippers in stores without feeling transported back to room 8B, could exist in her body without constant vigilance, could imagine a future that included relationship and career and joy alongside the PTSD she'd probably always carry. What mattered was that Brandon Cole had completed his degree in social work and was working at residential treatment facility for troubled teens using his own story to reach kids nobody else could reach, proving through his daily work that people could become better than their worst actions if they chose to do the hard work of transformation. What mattered was that Richard Cole had been released after serving 8 years, was living quietly in Wisconsin, working at legal aid clinic for low-income families, his career destroyed, but his capacity for genuine service finally emerging after years of pursuing only power. He'd written Maya a letter apologizing for everything his pride and arrogance had cost, had included a $100,000 check for her anti-bullying foundation, with note that said simply, "I can't undo the harm. I can only try to prevent it happening to others." Maya had cashed the check, sent brief acknowledgement. Would probably never speak to Richard directly because some people existed better at distance, but she could acknowledge that his change was real, even if forgiveness remained complicated. What mattered was that Jefferson Academy had become national model, that the Angel Watch program had been implemented in more than 12 schools across 19 states, that bullying incidents had dropped an average of 70 everywhere the program existed, that thousands of kids were safer because one girl had refused to stay silent. What mattered was that Rose had built thriving business, that she'd found love again with Leo, that she'd reconciled with her past in ways that honored both the person she'd been and the person she'd become. That Hawk had been recognized by the governor for community service, that the Iron Wolves were now known as protectors, rather than threats, that Brotherhood built on loyalty had proven more durable than institutions built on power. What mattered was that on Tuesday mornings, Maya still met her mother for coffee at the diner, near the old warehouse, still talked about everything, and nothing still felt the particular security that came from being loved unconditionally by someone who'd fought the world to keep you safe. The phone rang. Hawk's name appeared on screen. Maya answered, "Hey, Hawk." "Hey, kiddo. Just calling to make sure you're ready for graduation. Got 63 people riding down for it. Might cause a scene." Maya laughed, the sound genuine and unforced. "When have you ever not caused a scene?" "Fair point. Listen, I'm proud of you. Everything you've built, everything you've become. Your dad would be," his voice caught. "I know. Thank you. For everything. For showing up when I needed you. For teaching me that family is who fights for you. Always, Maya, always." After the call ended, Maya looked at herself in the mirror, seeing not the terrified 14-year-old who'd entered a warehouse begging for help, not the girl whose hair had been cut while people laughed, not even the survivor who'd spent 2 years learning to live with trauma. She saw a young woman who'd transformed suffering into purpose, who'd learned that asking for help was brave, who'd discovered that being broken and being strong weren't contradictory. Saw someone who carried scars but wasn't defined by them, who'd survived the worst and chosen to ensure others wouldn't have to. Saw someone who understood that courage wasn't absence of fear, but persistence despite it, that healing wasn't linear, but was possible, that the people who tried to destroy you didn't get to write your ending. She touched her hair, currently dyed purple, because she could, because her body was hers to modify as she chose, because reclaiming power meant making decisions for herself rather than in reaction to violence done to her. Whispered to the girl she'd been, "We made it, we survived, and we're going to help others survive too." Then she picked up her phone and posted one final time to @ bold and brave. "5 years ago today, someone tried to humiliate me into silence. Instead, I found my voice. To everyone who showed up when I needed them, thank you. To everyone still fighting their own battles, you are not alone. To everyone who thinks their suffering defines them, it doesn't. You define you. They cut my hair, but not my courage. And my courage sparked a fire that cannot be extinguished. Pass it on. Within hours, the post had 1 million views. Within days, it would be shared in classrooms, in counseling sessions, in support groups across the country. Within weeks, it would inspire 3 more kids to report bullying, 2 parents to demand school accountability, 1 teacher to refuse to stay silent when she witnessed cruelty. And somewhere in Riverside, Illinois, in a warehouse where motorcycles gleamed under fluorescent lights and brotherhood meant something deeper than blood, Hawk looked at the post on his phone and smiled. The girl he'd covered with his vest 5 years ago had become the woman who covered others with courage. The promise made at Daniel's funeral had been kept. Family protected its own. Always.